In the beginning, before pixels conquered our screens, there existed a man named Ralph Baer, an engineer who would plant the seed from which an entire civilization would grow. In 1966, while working at Sanders Associates, Baer became obsessed with a simple question. Could a television, that passive portal of broadcast dreams, become something else entirely? Something interactive? This wasn't about entertainment in the traditional sense. It was about fundamentally altering the relationship between human and machine. He believed that televisions, which sat in nearly every American home, could be transformed into something revolutionary. Baer's vision emerged from military defense contracts and industrial engineering, hardly romantic origins. Yet within that technological mundanity lay the spark of transformation. The idea that light and electricity could be choreographed into responsive experiences would haunt the imaginations of engineers for generations to come. We remember Baer not as an artist, but as an architect of new realities. His conviction that interactive television was inevitable made him dangerous in the best possible way. The future, he understood, wasn't something to predict. It was something to construct, pixel by pixel, line by line. The Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972, stands as one of history's most underappreciated technological milestones. Most gaming historians sprint past it toward Pong, but the Odyssey contains something more profound. It was the first commercial home console, a radical democratization of interactive computing. Before this moment, games existed only in arcade cabinets or on university computers, expensive, inaccessible machines guarded by institutions. The Odyssey changed everything by making interactivity a consumer product. It featured cartridge-based games, simple graphics rendered in black and white, and controllers that felt alien to hands accustomed only to remote controls. The system shipped with 28 games, many inspired by television, tennis, hockey, baseball, shooting galleries. But beneath the humble graphics lay something extraordinary, the understanding that players could author their own experiences. Overlays, paddles, and light guns transformed ordinary television sets into windows into new worlds. The Odyssey sold over 1 million units worldwide, yet remains largely forgotten in popular consciousness. This erasure itself is revealing. We prefer origin stories that are cleaner, more singular. Yet truth rarely cooperates with narrative convenience. The Odyssey's legacy whispers beneath every console that followed. Pong arrived in 1972 like a comet, sudden and impossible to ignore. Created by Atari's Nolan Bushnell and L. Alcorn, it was deceptively simple. 2 paddles, 1 ball, infinite possibility within constraint. The game's genius wasn't in its complexity but in its clarity. Anyone could understand Pong within seconds. No instruction manual could match the intuitive brilliance of watching a ball bounce, of understanding immediately that your controller commanded your paddle's destiny. Pong wasn't the first video game. That distinction belongs to earlier experiments like Tennis for Two or Space War, but it was the first to achieve cultural saturation. Arcade cabinets featuring Pong appeared in bars, restaurants, and shopping malls, and people lined up to experience this strange new entertainment. The electromagnetic hum of the arcade cabinet became a siren song for children and adolescents seeking something that television and pinball couldn't provide: agency. Agency was the actual innovation, not the aesthetics. With Pong, millions of people experienced for the first time the intoxicating feeling of pressing a button and witnessing an immediate, consequential response. This feedback loop, action, consequence, reaction, became the foundation upon which all interactive entertainment would be built. Pong taught us that simplicity, when executed with precision, could move civilizations. The 1970s arcade boom was more than an economic phenomenon. It was a psychological restructuring of public space. Arcades transformed from pinball parlors into temples of electronic experience, where the air crackled with electromagnetic energy and the walls sang with synthesized bleeps and bloops. Games like Space Invaders, released by Taito in 1978, became objects of cultural obsession, drawing millions of quarters from eager hands. Space Invaders represented something primal in human experience: the external threat, the endless wave of enemies descending methodically from above. The game tapped into archetypal anxieties: invasion, vulnerability, the need to defend one's territory. Its 8-bit graphics depicted alien ships as simple, geometric forms, yet players projected complex emotional narratives onto these pixels. A single quarter could provide minutes of engagement, and the progression from difficulty level to difficulty level offered a ladder of achievement that traditional entertainment couldn't match. The arcade became a liminal space where social boundaries dissolved. Teenagers competed against adults, strangers shared high-score dreams. The cabinet itself became a stage, and mastery became a form of social currency. These glowing boxes promised something radical: the possibility of transcendence through skill, through persistence, through the pure marriage of reflex and intention. Ralph Baer's journey to creating interactive television began not with games, but with a troubling realization during a car ride in 1966. Bushnell, his colleague, had seen a demonstration of space war on a computer at Stanford, and Baer became fixated on the possibility of bringing such experiences to home televisions. Yet the Magnavox Odyssey that eventually emerged from his vision contained something even more revolutionary than the games themselves: the cartridge system. This innovation, the ability to swap games without opening the console, represented a paradigm shift in consumer electronics. Before cartridges, devices were singular-purpose machines. With cartridges, a single console could host dozens of experiences. This modularity would become the foundation of the entire video game industry for decades. The cartridge wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. It meant that the hardware was separate from the software, that creators could develop games independent of console manufacturers, that the ecosystem could expand infinitely. Baer's Odyssey game library was relatively primitive, but the potential was staggering. Publishers saw opportunity, and the cartridge became the dominant form of game distribution until optical media would later challenge its supremacy. The cartridge, that simple plastic vessel of ROM chips, was perhaps the most important invention in gaming history. Without it, the industry as we know it could never have existed. The Atari 2600, released in 1977, was not the most technologically advanced console. It was not the most powerful. It was not the first to use cartridges. Yet it would become the system that defined home gaming for an entire generation. This $199 machine, expensive for the era, featured a simple processor, limited memory, and graphics capabilities that were already outdated when it shipped. What it possessed instead was something ineffable: inevitability. Atari had already proven their ability to create arcade hits. Now they were bringing arcade experiences into American living rooms. The 2600 launched with 9 games, including conversions of arcade classics like Space Invaders. When Space Invaders arrived on the 2600 in 1980, it transformed everything. Sales of the console exploded exponentially. Families who had never considered purchasing a gaming device suddenly wanted one. The 2600 wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, a gateway to experiences previously available only in arcades. The console's success was so complete that Atari became synonymous with video games themselves, a linguistic flattening of meaning that speaks to the system's cultural dominance. Yet this dominance came with a cost. The industry would soon discover that the Atari 2600 had opened a door that nobody could control. The Atari 2600 cartridge library grew rapidly, and with rapid growth came catastrophic failure. By the early 1980s, third-party developers were flooding the market with games of staggering mediocrity. Titles like E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a game so poorly designed it allegedly became a symbol of industry excess, exemplified the problem. There were no quality controls, no curation, no mechanism to prevent the ecosystem from being poisoned by garbage. The E.T. game, released in 1982 to capitalize on the film's popularity, was developed in only 5 weeks. The result was unplayable, confusing, buggy, and joyless. Yet this game was only one symptom of a much larger disease. The video game market had become saturated with third-rate products, each hoping to capitalize on the gaming craze without understanding what made games compelling. Retailers couldn't move inventory. Consumers grew frustrated by the endless parade of broken, unfinished experiences. Arcade games, which maintained quality through the constraint of physical machines and the need for repeated quarters, had no equivalent in the home market. The video game crash of 1983 followed inevitably. The industry contracted violently. Atari's market value collapsed. Publishers disappeared overnight. Some predicted that video games were a fad, a momentary obsession that had burnt itself out. They were wrong, but the industry had learned a crucial lesson. Without curation and quality control, consumer trust dies. In the ashes of the North American video game crash, Nintendo, a Japanese company known for playing cards and toys, entered the market with a device called the Famicom, family computer. Released in Japan in 1983, the Famicom represented a studied response to the crash. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, understood that the industry had failed not because games were inherently flawed, but because the market had been flooded with terrible products. The Famicom included a lockout chip, a technological mechanism that prevented unauthorized cartridges from running on the hardware. This wasn't an arbitrary restriction, it was a statement of philosophy. Nintendo was saying, quality matters more than openness. The company would personally approve every game released on their platform. This gatekeeping, which seems restrictive in retrospect, actually saved the industry. By ensuring that only approved, tested games appeared on their hardware, Nintendo restored consumer confidence. Parents who had been burned by the crash could now trust Nintendo products. The strategy worked. The Famicom became the best-selling console of its generation, selling over 60 million units worldwide. Nintendo's insistence on quality curation, a model that would influence the industry for decades, was born not from arrogance but from understanding that trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim. The Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, arrived in North America in 1985 with a name that was itself strategic. By calling it an entertainment system rather than a video game console, Nintendo was making a statement about what their device represented. Games were just one aspect of a broader vision. The NES shipped with a light gun accessory, could connect to a television, and included a robot called ROB that could interact with certain games through light sensors. These weren't just peripherals. They were declarations that gaming was not a niche activity but a form of home entertainment that could compete with television itself. The library of launch titles included Donkey Kong, a game by Shigeru Miyamoto that demonstrated Nintendo's commitment to innovation. Miyamoto, who would become one of the most influential game designers in history, had reimagined the arcade game Donkey Kong for the NES, improving graphics and introducing new mechanics. His work demonstrated that console games weren't merely arcade ports, they were opportunities for entirely new creative expression. The NES quickly dominated the market, achieving market penetration that made Nintendo a household name. The industry, so recently decimated, was reborn under Nintendo's careful stewardship. Gaming would never again be merely the province of arcades and hobbyists. It had become domesticated, legitimized, normalized as entertainment for all ages. Super Mario Bros., released in 1985 for the NES, is perhaps the most important video game ever created. Not because it invented platformers, or because it possessed the most innovative mechanics. Both claims would be historically inaccurate. Its importance derives from something more fundamental. It perfectly executed a vision of what a video game could be. Shigeru Miyamoto and his team created a game in which every element served the core mechanic of jumping. Level design taught players through experience rather than instruction. Progression felt natural, inevitable, like the game was guiding you toward mastery rather than forcing it upon you. The game's aesthetics, the cheerful pixel art, the catchy music by Koji Kondo, the friendly character design, made gaming feel inviting rather than intimidating. Super Mario Bros. Wasn't the best-selling game ever because it was technically superior. It dominated because it understood something profound about human psychology. The joy of movement, the satisfaction of precise control, the pleasure of progression from simple to complex challenges. These are universal desires, and Mario fulfilled them with absolute clarity. The game sold over 40 million copies and single-handedly resurrected consumer confidence in home gaming. It demonstrated that carefully crafted, artfully designed games could achieve cultural resonance that transcended mere novelty. Mario became an icon, a digital ambassador for the entire medium. The 8-bit console war that erupted in the 1980s was not merely about hardware specifications or processing power. It was about competing visions of what gaming should become. Sega, Nintendo's primary challenger, believed in speed, in arcade translation, in the notion that games should capture the raw excitement of the arcade cabinet. Sega's Master System featured superior graphics processing compared to the NES, capable of rendering more colors and more detailed sprites. Yet the Master System struggled commercially outside of certain markets. Nintendo, by contrast, had invested heavily in securing exclusive titles from top developers. Nintendo's strategy of curation and exclusivity proved more valuable than raw technical specifications. Consumers, it turned out, didn't choose consoles based on processor speed, they chose based on game libraries. This insight would shape industry strategy for decades to come. The winners in gaming were not those with the most powerful hardware, but those with the most compelling software. Sega's failure to win the 8-bit generation represented a crucial lesson. In entertainment, content is sovereign. Architecture serves content, never the reverse. This principle would persist through every subsequent console generation, though companies would continue to misunderstand it, betting on technical superiority rather than cultivating relationships with creators. The introduction of the Sega Genesis in 1989 and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990 marked a transition into the 16-bit era, a generational leap in graphical fidelity and processing capability. The Genesis, powered by a Motorola 68000 processor, represented Sega's renewed commitment to technical supremacy. Sega secured a crucial exclusive, Sonic the Hedgehog, a character designed to represent speed, dynamism, and rebellion against Nintendo's perceived dominance. Sonic, with his cyan coloring and attitude, was explicitly positioned as the antithesis to Mario's cheerful traditionalism. The marketing war between Sonic and Mario was as important as the technical specifications. Consumers weren't just choosing hardware, they were choosing identity. Meanwhile, the SNES, released in 1990, featured enhanced graphical capabilities and a stronger game library that ultimately gave Nintendo the generational victory. The 16-bit era demonstrated that the console wars were fought not just on the battlefield of technical specifications, but in the realm of culture and identity. Gamers didn't simply choose the console with superior processing power, they chose the console that reflected their own aspirations. This psychological dimension of gaming would only become more important as technology advanced. Sonic the Hedgehog, released in 1991, represented a seismic shift in game design philosophy. Where Mario games emphasized precision and caution, Sonic prioritized momentum and flow. The Hedgehog's speed created a fundamentally different player psychology. You couldn't pause and contemplate your next move, you had to commit, to trust that your reflexes would carry you forward. Sonic's Genesis hardware processed graphics significantly faster than the NES could manage, and level design evolved accordingly. Loops and ramps took advantage of the Hedgehog's velocity, creating a sense of exhilaration that was difficult to achieve in platformers before this moment. The character design itself was revolutionary, a rebellious attitude rendered in pixels, complete with cool sunglasses in promotional materials. Sonic tapped into adolescent desire for cool, for speed, for freedom from restraint. Nintendo's mascot represented wholesomeness and family-friendly values. Sonic represented the desire to break rules. This contrast wasn't accidental. Sega explicitly marketed themselves as the edgier alternative. The strategy worked commercially, at least in North America, where Sega's market share climbed steadily. Yet Sonic's legacy is complicated. While the character remains beloved, many of Sonic's games throughout the 1990s and 2000s would struggle with design coherence, suggesting that momentum and speed, while exhilarating, are difficult foundations upon which to build sustained gameplay experiences. The graphical revolution of the 16-bit era represented more than technical enhancement. It was a philosophical shift in how games visualized themselves. The 8-bit systems rendered worlds in stark abstraction, blocky, symbolic representations that players had to imaginatively complete. A few pixels arranged carefully could suggest a castle, a soldier, a landscape. The 16-bit systems, by contrast, offered greater fidelity, more detailed sprites, more sophisticated color palettes. This increased realism changed player engagement. Games no longer required as much imaginative projection. The screen presented worlds that approximated visual reality more closely. This transition had profound psychological implications. Games became less abstract and more immersive. The gap between what the screen showed and what the player imagined narrowed considerably. Developers like Tim Rogers and other designers began experimenting with how visual density affected pacing and atmosphere. A meticulously detailed background could convey mood in ways that simple tiles could not. The 16-bit era established that graphics weren't merely decorative, they were narrative and emotional tools. The visual language of games evolved from symbolic abstraction toward representational complexity. This evolution would accelerate dramatically in subsequent generations as processing power increased and 3D graphics replaced 2D rendering as the industry standard. The Legend of Zelda, released in 1986 for the NES, invented an entire genre while simultaneously establishing principles of game design that remain influential decades later. Shigeru Miyamoto and his team created a game that presented players with a vast world to explore, secrets to discover, and puzzles to solve. The game offered minimal guidance, a simple instruction manual, and that was all. Players were expected to explore, to fail, to learn through experimentation. This philosophy of emergent gameplay, where the player's own curiosity drives the experience, became foundational to open-world design. The game's structure incorporated interconnected spaces, item progression that gated access to new areas, and dungeons that required both combat and puzzle solving. This formula would be refined and repeated across decades of gaming. The Legend of Zelda established that games could tell stories through exploration and discovery rather than cutscenes and dialogue. The magic system, the variety of weapons, the non-linear progression, all of these elements worked together to create a sense of agency and discovery that was unprecedented in its sophistication. By proving that players wanted to explore, that they valued agency and discovery over linear progression, Zelda expanded the potential of what games could be. The game sold over 6 million copies, demonstrating that the audience for complex, exploration-focused games was substantial and hungry for new experiences. Metroidvania, the genre defined by games like Metroid and Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, emerged from the exploration-focused design that Zelda had pioneered but applied the framework to side-scrolling action games. Metroid, released in 1986 for the NES, presented players with an alien world to explore, full of hidden passages and gated areas that required specific power-ups to access. The game's environmental storytelling, conveyed through level design rather than dialogue, created a sense of lonely exploration that was simultaneously isolating and exhilarating. Samus Aran, the game's protagonist, was rendered with minimal animation yet conveyed a sense of purposeful isolation. Later, Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, released in 1997, would synthesize Metroid's exploration with a more lavish Gothic aesthetic and introduce the map feature that would become standard. The Metroidvania formula proved robust. Present players with a large, interconnected world, gate progression through abilities or items, reward exploration with power-ups and narrative revelations. This structure satisfies a deep human desire, the desire to map unknown territory, to understand the shape of a world, to feel mastery through exploration. These games became exemplars of how to design nonlinear spaces that nonetheless felt purposeful and directional. The rise of 3D graphics in the 1990s represented the most significant technological transition in gaming since the shift from arcade to home consoles. The Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64 all attempted to translate 2D gaming into three-dimensional space. The challenge was profound. 2D game design had evolved sophisticated principles over decades. 3D design was largely unmapped territory. Early 3D games often struggled, their cameras flailing uncertainly, their controls feeling imprecise. The polygon count limitation of early 3D meant that characters and environments looked abstract, sometimes uncanny in their geometric simplicity. Yet the potential was tantalizing. 3D offered possibilities that 2D could never achieve. the ability to position the camera anywhere, the potential for more complex level design, the promise of worlds that felt less constrained. The industry bet heavily on 3D, and the results were initially inconsistent. Some early 3D games, like Star Fox on the SNES, felt more like technical demonstrations than fully realized experiences. But the trajectory was clear: 3D would become the standard. This transition required entirely new thinking about camera control, player input, perspective, and environmental design. Developers had to essentially reinvent game design from first principles. Super Mario 64, released in 1996 for the Nintendo 64, was the first genuinely great 3D platformer, and its influence on the industry cannot be overstated. Shigeru Miyamoto and his team took the lessons of 2D Mario games and extrapolated them into three-dimensional space. The camera, controlled with the C buttons, became a crucial element of the design rather than an afterthought. Levels were designed with multiple paths and secret areas, encouraging exploration. The game's analog stick controller, novel at the time, allowed for precise analog control of Mario's movement, adding nuance to platforming that button-based controls couldn't achieve. The game demonstrated that 3D platforming wasn't inherently inferior to 2D, it simply required different thinking. By allowing the player to approach challenges from multiple angles, to explore vertical spaces with newfound freedom, Mario 64 expanded what platformers could be. The game sold over 11 million copies, proving that audiences would embrace 3D gaming if the implementation was thoughtful and well executed. Mario 64 became a template for 3D action games across the industry. Its emphasis on responsive controls, camera management, and emergent level design established principles that persist in game design to this day. The Sony PlayStation, released in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in North America, represented a seismic shift in the gaming industry's power structure. Sony, a company known for consumer electronics, entered gaming with a cynical advantage. They understood manufacturing, distribution, and marketing at scales that Nintendo and Sega could not match. The PlayStation's hardware was based on existing technology rather than cutting-edge innovation, yet this pragmatism made the system economical to produce and price competitively. The console's architecture made 3D development relatively straightforward for developers familiar with PC programming. This accessibility attracted a large developer community. Within years, the PlayStation accumulated a library of thousands of games, more than any competitor could match. The strategy was almost antithetical to Nintendo's carefully curated approach, yet it worked. By opening their ecosystem to a broader range of developers and publishers, Sony created a gravitational pull that made the PlayStation the default choice for many gamers. The PlayStation's success demonstrated that the gaming industry was no longer dominated by any single company or philosophy. Power had shifted. The console wars were no longer competitions between competing visions but competitions between competing ecosystems. The disc-based format adopted by the PlayStation, Dreamcast, and eventually the GameCube and Xbox represented the death of the cartridge era. Discs offered multiple advantages. Greater storage capacity meant larger game worlds and higher resolution graphics. Production costs were lower, loading times were longer but more predictable. The cartridge, which had dominated gaming since the Atari 2600, became obsolete almost overnight. This transition had enormous implications for game design. 16-bit and 32-bit cartridge-based games had evolved sophisticated techniques for handling memory limitations, compression, streaming, clever asset management. Disc-based games could simply load more content. This shifted developer thinking from constraint-based design toward content abundance design. Games grew larger, worlds became more densely packed, cinematics could be longer and more elaborate. The trade-off wasn't necessarily positive. Some argue that constraint breeds creativity, that the limitations of earlier systems forced elegance that abundance would never achieve. Yet the disc era also enabled experiences that cartridge limitations would have prevented. Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997, spanned 3 discs and told an elaborate story with cinematic ambition that would have been technically impossible on cartridge-based hardware. The shift from cartridges to discs marked a transition in game design philosophy, from economy toward abundance. Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997 for the PlayStation, transcended gaming's boundaries and achieved cultural significance that extended far beyond its dedicated audience. The game told a sprawling story across 3 discs, featuring complex characters, political intrigue, and emotional depth rarely seen in interactive entertainment. The narrative, crafted by Kazushige Nojima and Yoshinori Kaitase, centered on Cloud, a former soldier fighting against a megacorporation while grappling with questions of identity and memory. The game's ambition was staggering. It married sophisticated storytelling with engaging mechanics, marrying narrative and gameplay in ways that felt integrated rather than separated. The aesthetic, a blend of 3D character models and pre-rendered backgrounds, created a distinctive visual language that remains recognizable decades later. The soundtrack, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, became iconic, with pieces like One-Winged Angel achieving recognition beyond gaming circles. Final Fantasy VII demonstrated that games could achieve narrative complexity matching the best cinema, while maintaining interactive engagement that film could never match. Its cultural impact extended into clothing, merchandise, and subsequent remakes, suggesting that the game had achieved something beyond entertainment. It had become a cultural touchstone. The game's success proved that mainstream audiences were hungry for narratively ambitious gaming experiences. The Dreamcast, Sega's final console before exiting the hardware business, represented both a technological achievement and a business tragedy. Released in 1998 in Japan and 1999 in North America, the Dreamcast featured DVD streaming capabilities years before the technology was standard, online gaming support through a built-in modem, and processing power that matched or exceeded its competitors. The hardware was technically sound, the game library was diverse and strong. Yet the Dreamcast arrived during a period when the PlayStation was already achieving dominance, and the PlayStation 2, announced with DVD playback capabilities, was on the horizon. Sega's financial position was precarious after the failures of the Saturn and earlier missteps. The company could not outlast the competition. When DVD technology became crucial to console success, Sega's absence of DVD support in the Dreamcast became a fatal liability. By 2001, just 2 years after the North American launch, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast and exited the console business. The company that had once challenged Nintendo for dominance was now reduced to a software publisher. The Dreamcast's failure wasn't a failure of the technology itself, but of timing and business strategy. The console is remembered fondly by those who owned one, suggesting that it was ahead of its time, a casualty of an industry moving faster than any single company could follow. The PlayStation 2, released in 2000 in Japan and 2001 in North America, became the best-selling console in history, with over 155 million units sold globally. The system's dominance derived from multiple factors: built-in DVD playback, which made it an entertainment device beyond gaming, a diverse, carefully cultivated library of games, strong third-party developer support, and Sega's exit from the hardware market, which consolidated players around fewer platforms. The PS2's processing power was adequate but not superior to its competitors. Its true advantage was ecosystem momentum. By 2001, thousands of games were in development for the PS2, including titles from every major publisher. Gamers faced a simple calculus. If they wanted access to the broadest library of experiences, they purchased a PlayStation 2. The system's cultural reach extended beyond traditional gamers. The combination of DVD playback and gaming capabilities made it an attractive media device for households that might otherwise have never purchased a gaming console. This broadening of the audience expanded the market for games. Publishers began investing in games designed for broader demographics, sports titles, music games, narrative-driven experiences. The PS2 generation demonstrated that console dominance creates network effects that are nearly impossible for competitors to overcome once momentum shifts. Grand Theft Auto 3, released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2, fundamentally altered expectations for what games could be. Rockstar Games' creation was not the first open-world game, nor the first to offer narrative complexity, but it was the first to integrate these elements into a large-scale, living world. The game presented a vast city, Liberty City, inspired by New York, populated with civilians going about their daily routines, a traffic system that responded to player presence, and a sprawling story involving numerous characters, each with their own motivations. The genius of GTA 3 was that it didn't force narrative progression. Players could engage with the story missions or ignore them entirely, instead driving through the city, robbing cars, committing crimes, exploring neighborhoods. The game respected player agency in ways that linear games could not. The sheer scale of the world, multiple neighborhoods, dozens of buildings to enter, hundreds of secrets to discover, created a sense of immersion that few games had achieved. The moral ambiguity of the protagonist, Claude Speed, a criminal navigating a corrupt system, added thematic depth. GTA 3 demonstrated that open-world games could achieve narrative sophistication while simultaneously offering emergent gameplay experiences. The success of GTA 3 spawned countless imitators, and the open-world formula became dominant in AAA game development for decades. The introduction of online multiplayer gaming through console networks fundamentally transformed gaming culture. Xbox Live, launched with the Xbox in 2002, created infrastructure for seamless, standardized online play. While online gaming had existed before, on PCs through services like Battle.net, console online gaming was previously fragmented and unreliable. Xbox Live introduced features that seem obvious in retrospect: standardized messaging systems, friend lists, achievement tracking. More importantly, it created community infrastructure that made multiplayer gaming not just technically possible but socially integrated. Players could see what friends were playing, could join games easily, could develop relationships with other players across geographic boundaries. This networking effect transformed gaming from a primarily solitary or local multiplayer activity into a globally connected social experience. Games designed with online multiplayer in mind, like Halo 2, released in 2004, achieved cultural resonance that extended beyond core gamers. The ability to play against friends across the world, to compete in ranked matches, to form clans and teams, these capabilities attracted millions of players who had previously been indifferent to gaming. Online multiplayer created new social hierarchies, new forms of competition, new avenues for skill expression and community building. Halo: Combat Evolved, released in 2001 for the Xbox, essentially created the modern first-person shooter template for console gaming. While first-person shooters had thrived on PC for years, games like Doom, Quake, and Half-Life had defined the genre. Translating the genre to console controllers was technically and conceptually challenging. The analog stick couldn't provide the precision of a mouse. Earlier FPS attempts on consoles had generally failed. Bungie's solution was elegant. They slowed the game down. By reducing enemy speeds, increasing weapon effectiveness, and careful adjusting aim sensitivity, Halo made FPS gameplay work on console controllers. The campaign narrative, featuring the Spartan soldier Master Chief fighting the alien Covenant, provided thematic coherence. The aliens' artificial intelligence, which prioritized tactical positioning over accuracy, made encounters feel dynamic and challenging rather than punishing. By proving that shooters could work on consoles, Halo opened the floodgates for a generation of console-based shooters. Call of Duty, Gears of War, Borderlands, and countless others followed, each building on the template Halo had established. The game sold millions of copies and made the Xbox a credible competitor to the PlayStation 2. Halo demonstrated that successful console gaming required not blind imitation of PC templates but thoughtful adaptation to controller limitations. The motion control revolution, initiated by the Nintendo Wii in 2006, represented an attempt to democratize gaming through more intuitive input methods. The Wii Remote, featuring accelerometers that detected motion, allowed players to control games through physical gestures rather than button combinations. Games like Wii Sports, which shipped with many consoles, demonstrated this potential. Players could simulate bowling, tennis, and baseball through physical motions that approximated real activities. The Wii's appeal extended beyond traditional gamers. Families, elderly individuals, and casual players found the motion controls approachable and entertaining. Wii Sports became a cultural phenomenon, with millions of families gathering to play virtual tennis together. The system's success demonstrated that there existed an enormous market for gaming experiences outside the hardcore demographic. The Wii became the best-selling console of its generation, outselling both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 despite being technologically inferior. This success challenged the industry's assumption that more powerful hardware was inherently superior. Player intent, accessibility, and social engagement could outweigh raw processing power. The Wii's legacy is complicated. Many motion-controlled games felt gimmicky in retrospect, but its cultural impact was undeniable. By broadening gaming's audience, the Wii transformed the industry's business model and player demographics fundamentally. The rise of digital distribution through platforms like Steam fundamentally disrupted the physical game distribution model that had dominated since the cartridge era. Valve's Steam platform, launched in 2003, began as a means to deliver Counter-Strike updates but evolved into a comprehensive digital game store and social platform. By allowing developers to distribute games directly to consumers without physical retail constraints, Steam democratized game publishing. Smaller independent developers could now reach millions of players without negotiating shelf space with retailers. Games could be updated continuously, patched immediately, and distributed instantly. This represented a paradigm shift in how games were sold and experienced. Digital distribution also fundamentally changed game design. Games could be updated post-launch, new content could be delivered as DLC, entire games could be rebalanced based on player feedback. The traditional model of release day being the final state of the game evaporated. This continuous update cycle became standard practice, and players' relationship with games transformed. A game at launch was viewed not as a finished product but as a beginning state that would evolve. This shift enabled both creative experimentation and exploitative business practices. The potential for continuous revenue streams through cosmetic DLC, battle passes, and other monetization systems became a defining feature of contemporary gaming. The phenomenon of gaming as social spectacle emerged with streaming platforms like Twitch, founded in 2011. As internet bandwidth increased and technology improved, the ability to broadcast gameplay to audiences in real time became increasingly feasible. Streamers transformed gaming from a solitary activity into a form of entertainment consumption. Millions of viewers watched others play games, creating new parasocial relationships and forms of community. Professional gaming, esports, evolved from basement competitions into televised events featuring prize pools in the millions of dollars. Games like League of Legends, Dota 2, and StarCraft 2 became spectator sports, with fans following teams and players with the fervor traditionally reserved for traditional athletics. This evolution fundamentally transformed how games were designed. Developers began considering how games would appear on streams, whether they featured moments of dramatic tension or impressive visual spectacle. Game balance became influenced not just by internal testing but by how professional players would break the game or exploit mechanics. The shift from games as private experiences to games as public performances represented a massive cultural evolution. Gaming had transitioned from a stigmatized activity into mainstream entertainment, and streaming platforms were the primary vehicle for that transformation. Minecraft's release in 2009 began as a humble indie project by Marcus Persson, later sold to Microsoft for billions of dollars, forever changing perceptions of what games could achieve. Minecraft's premise was deceptively simple: place and destroy blocks in a procedurally generated world. Yet this simplicity concealed profound possibility. Players could build structures, explore caves, fight monsters, or simply exist peacefully in the world. The game had no prescribed objective, no narrative progression, no achievement system, at least initially. This radical player agency attracted millions of users. Minecraft became a sandbox for creativity, a digital world where players from all skill levels could express themselves. Teachers recognized Minecraft's potential as an educational tool. Architects used it to prototype designs. Artists created elaborate structures of stunning beauty. Minecraft's success demonstrated that commercially successful games need not feature AAA production values or sophisticated narratives. Gameplay, creativity, and player agency could outweigh cinematic presentation. The game's accessibility, available on numerous platforms from console to mobile, expanded its reach exponentially. Minecraft became the best-selling video game of all time, with hundreds of millions of copies sold across all platforms. The game's enduring popularity, years after its initial release, suggested that it had tapped into something fundamental about human motivation, the desire to create, to explore, to leave a mark on a world. The Dark Souls franchise, beginning in 2011, created a new template for challenging action games that prioritized demanding combat over narrative accessibility. From Software's creation featured punishing difficulty, minimal handholding, and combat that required precise timing and pattern recognition. Dying sent the player back to checkpoints, losing accumulated progress. Many considered the game frustratingly difficult, yet millions embraced this challenge. The difficulty became the point, not an unfortunate byproduct. Overcoming Dark Souls challenges provided a sense of accomplishment that more accessible games couldn't match. The game's deliberately cryptic storytelling, told through environmental details and item descriptions rather than explicit exposition, attracted players who engaged with gaming at a deeper analytical level. Dark Souls proved that commercial success didn't require accessibility. A difficult, obscure game could become a cultural phenomenon. The franchise's success spawned numerous imitators, and Souls-like became a recognized genre. Publishers realized that there existed a substantial audience for challenging experiences, that difficulty itself could be a selling point rather than an obstacle to overcome. This validation allowed developers to pursue demanding designs without pressure to compromise for mass-market accessibility. Dark Souls' legacy extended beyond mechanics into philosophy, the notion that games could respect player intelligence and agency by refusing to simplify their design. The introduction of virtual reality to consumer markets, beginning with the Oculus Rift's 2016 release, promised to transport gaming into new dimensional territory. VR gaming required complete reimagination of traditional control schemes. Instead of an external camera viewing a character, the player inhabited a first-person perspective embodied in virtual space. Hand controllers allowed gestural interaction. Immersion became literal. The headset removed peripheral vision, creating complete sensory isolation from the real world. Early VR games demonstrated the medium's potential, feeling genuinely present in virtual spaces, the visceral sensation of height when standing on a virtual cliff, the intuitive appeal of reaching out and manipulating objects. Yet VR also revealed challenges. Motion sickness afflicted some players, room scale requirements limited accessibility, high costs restricted adoption. The medium remained niche, unable to achieve the mass-market penetration that enthusiasts had predicted. Nevertheless, VR's emergence signaled that gaming's evolution continued. The industry remained obsessed with more immersive experiences, better graphical fidelity, technologies that would collapse the boundary between digital and physical. Whether VR would ever achieve mainstream dominance remained uncertain, but its presence represented gaming's ongoing commitment to pushing sensory boundaries. Mobile gaming's explosion through smartphones fundamentally democratized game development and consumption. The App Store, launched in 2008, made game distribution frictionless. Games could be monetized through small upfront purchases, in-app purchases, or advertising. This accessibility allowed independent developers to reach audiences previously available only to well-funded companies. Casual games, designed for quick play sessions rather than sustained engagement, found enormous audiences. Games like Candy Crush Saga, released in 2012, generated billions of dollars in revenue through free-to-play mechanics that monetized through in-game purchases and battle passes. The success of mobile gaming demonstrated that gaming's audience extended far beyond traditional console players. Millions of people who would never own a console became engaged in gaming through their phones. This expansion of the audience transformed the industry's economics. Mobile gaming's revenue exceeded traditional console and PC gaming combined. Publishers began designing games for mobile-first strategies, recognizing that phones represented the largest addressable market. The accessibility of mobile platforms attracted female players, older players, and casual players at unprecedented scale. Gaming's demographic profile broadened from a male-dominated space toward gender parity, suggesting that gaming's appeal was far more universal than the arcade era had suggested. The phenomenon of games as a service fundamentally altered expectations for how games would be structured and monetized. Rather than selling a finished product, games were increasingly designed as ongoing platforms, continuously updated with new content, new mechanics, and new cosmetics. Fortnite, released in 2017 by Epic Games, exemplified this model. The game featured a free-to-play base game, regular seasonal updates introducing new mechanics and cosmetics, a battle pass system that monetized progression, and cosmetic item purchases that generated billions in revenue. The game became a social platform as much as a game, a place where friends gathered, where cultural events occurred, where musicians performed virtual concerts. This transformation reflected a broader shift in gaming culture. Games were no longer discrete products but ongoing communities. Players invested not just time but identity in these shared spaces. The business model generated enormous revenue for publishers, though it also invited criticisms about predatory monetization, gambling-like mechanics, and exploitative design that prioritized engagement over player well-being. The games-as-a-service model demonstrated that the most profitable games were often designed with psychological manipulation in mind, leveraging addiction principles rather than compelling gameplay to drive engagement and spending. The technological transition to next-generation consoles, with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X arriving in 2020, revealed a curious plateau in hardware innovation. While these systems featured more powerful processors and faster storage, the generational leap felt less revolutionary than previous transitions. Graphics improved incrementally, loading times decreased substantially, frame rates increased to 60 frames per second or beyond. Yet the games didn't look dramatically different from their previous generation counterparts. The transition from 8-bit to 16-bit, from 2D to 3D, from SD to HD, each had represented visual revolutions. The current generation offered refinement rather than revolution. This plateau suggested that the industry had reached a threshold where graphical improvement would be measured in subtle details rather than wholesale transformations. Motion capture had become standard for cinematic titles, resulting in realistic character animations. Procedural generation techniques created more detailed environments. Ray tracing simulated physically accurate light behavior. Yet these advances, while meaningful, felt incremental compared to the transformations of previous eras. The plateau raised existential questions about gaming's future. If raw processing power offered diminishing returns, what would drive innovation? Many argued that innovation would emerge from game design, from new forms of storytelling, from novel mechanics rather than technological specifications. The COVID-19 pandemic's impact on gaming and gaming culture cannot be overstated. As physical spaces closed and people retreated indoors, gaming became a primary form of entertainment and social connection. Online multiplayer games allowed friends to maintain relationships across distance. Games provided escapism during unprecedented isolation. Animal Crossing: New Horizons, released in March 2020, became a cultural touchstone, a gentle, peaceful game that offered respite from global turmoil. The pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway: the shift toward online multiplayer, the growth of streaming platforms, the expansion of gaming beyond traditional platforms. It also revealed gaming's fundamental appeal, not as a niche hobby but as a universal human activity capable of providing meaning, connection, and joy during periods of isolation. The industry's response was rapid. Tournaments moved online, streaming platforms grew exponentially, games explicitly designed for pandemic-era connection flourished. By the pandemic's end, gaming had solidified its position as a central form of entertainment and cultural expression. The boundary between gamers and everyone else had blurred so thoroughly that the distinction had become meaningless. Gaming had become democratized to the point where nearly everyone was a gamer. They simply used different platforms and engaged with different genres. Artificial intelligence's integration into gaming, advancing through machine learning and neural networks, promised to revolutionize NPC behavior and world simulation. Early applications featured AI opponents learning from player behavior, adapting strategies, and providing increasingly sophisticated challenges. More ambitious applications involved procedurally generated narratives, where AI constructed dialogue and story elements responsive to player choices. These developments raised provocative possibilities, games where NPCs possessed genuine-seeming personalities, where conversations felt dynamic rather than scripted. Yet they also raised concerns. If AI generated sufficient sophisticated behavior, would players form attachments to non-sentient entities? Would the boundary between simulated and genuine relationships become dangerously blurred? Furthermore, AI training required enormous amounts of data, raising questions about consent and copyright. Games trained on existing creative works without permission, implicitly stealing from creators. The integration of AI into gaming represented the medium's next frontier, but also its most ethically fraught one. The technology promised sophistication while simultaneously enabling exploitation and deception. The emergence of independent game developers, enabled by accessible game engines and digital distribution, democratized game creation in ways that challenged the traditional AAA dominance. Engines like Unity and Unreal Engine, made available free or affordable for independent developers, eliminated technical barriers that had previously required million-dollar budgets. Games created by small teams, sometimes just one person, achieved critical and commercial success. Celeste, developed by a small team and released in 2018, became a beloved platformer celebrating themes of mental health and self-improvement. Hollow Knight, created by Australian developer Team Cherry, demonstrated that independent games could achieve the polish and sophistication previously associated with major publishers. These successes validated the notion that creativity and design mattered far more than budget. The best games of recent years came from an increasingly mixed ecosystem, AAA titles from major publishers alongside indie gems from tiny teams. This democratization expanded gaming's creative possibilities. Games could explore niche themes, unusual mechanics, experimental narratives that AAA publishers might deem commercially risky. The indie game movement became a crucial source of innovation, pushing the medium forward in directions that conservative publishers wouldn't venture. The concept of crunch culture, endemic to game development, represented a dark underbelly of the industry's creativity. Developers routinely worked excessive hours, often without additional compensation, in final months before release. The pressure to meet deadlines, to deliver polished products, to satisfy player expectations created a culture where extreme overwork was normalized. This exploitation was particularly concentrated among younger, less experienced developers who lacked leverage to negotiate better conditions. Major releases like Crunch at Rockstar Games or the chaotic development of Cyberpunk 2077 became emblematic of how badly the industry treated its creators. The problem was systemic. Publishers expected increasingly polished, content-rich games with shorter development cycles and constrained budgets. Developers absorbed the resulting pressure through excessive work. This culture had human costs. Burnout was rampant. Developer turnover was high. The most talented people frequently left the industry for better compensated, less demanding work elsewhere. By 2020s, conversations about labor conditions in game development became increasingly prominent. Workers began organizing, unionization efforts emerged, and public criticism of exploitative practices intensified. Yet change came slowly. The industry's business model, which depended on underpaying creative labor, remained largely unchanged. The creativity that had generated billions in revenue for publishers came at the expense of worker well-being. The question of video game preservation became increasingly urgent as older games became technically difficult to access. Games designed for obsolete hardware, arcade cabinets, cartridge consoles, computers long since abandoned, existed in precarious states. Companies guarded intellectual property fiercely, preventing preservation through emulation or re-release. Rare, valuable games became inaccessible, disappearing from living memory. This loss represented a cultural tragedy. Games were artistic works worthy of preservation alongside literature and film, yet they were treated as disposable products. The Library of Congress began acquiring games for archival purposes. Academic institutions studied game history. Yet the industry's reticence to allow preservation efforts continued. Companies that could easily re-release old games on modern platforms chose not to, fearing that such releases might cannibalize sales of new games. Meanwhile, older games existed in limbo, not available legitimately, yet too valuable to be forgotten. This tension between commercial interests and cultural preservation remained unresolved. Future generations might have no access to games that define the medium's history, not because the technology was impossible, but because legal frameworks and corporate power prevented it. The psychological mechanisms underlying gaming addiction received increasing scientific attention. Researchers identified how variable reward schedules, progression systems, and social pressure created behavioral patterns resembling substance addiction. Loot boxes, randomized rewards purchased with real money, exemplified mechanics designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Players became trapped in feedback loops where spending generated dopamine rewards, which reinforced the behavior. Games designed with psychological manipulation as a core principle raised serious ethical questions. Were developers and publishers responsible for potential harm? Did they have obligations to protect vulnerable populations, children, those with addiction vulnerabilities? The gaming industry, like social media platforms, faced accusations of deliberately exploiting psychological weaknesses for commercial gain. China's government began implementing restrictions on gaming, including bans on loot boxes in some circumstances, suggesting that even authoritarian regimes recognized gaming's potential for psychological manipulation. Western regulators began investigating whether gaming mechanics qualified as gambling. The industry's response was mostly defensive, denying that their designs were exploitative, pointing to player agency and choice. Yet the evidence of intentional psychological manipulation was abundant in patent filings and developer documentation. The question remained, would industry self-regulation prove sufficient, or would government intervention become necessary? The relationship between gaming and violence, debated for decades, remained unresolved by empirical research. Numerous studies failed to establish causal links between gaming and violent behavior, yet politicians and moral entrepreneurs continued asserting such connections. Moral panics emerged periodically around games containing violent content, with critics demanding regulation or bans. Schools held presentations warning parents about gaming's dangers. Yet the evidence suggested that gaming, even violent gaming, was not inherently harmful. Teenagers had grown up with violent games for decades without corresponding increases in violent crime. In fact, violent crime rates had generally declined as gaming became more popular. This disconnect suggested that the relationship was more complex than simple causation. Perhaps violent games provided cathartic outlets for aggression. Perhaps the skills learned in games, problem-solving, resource management, strategic thinking outweighed any potential negative effects. Or perhaps gaming violence was simply irrelevant to real-world violence, with other factors, poverty, trauma, access to weapons, being far more determinative. The persistence of gaming violence claims despite empirical disconfirmation suggested that the concerns were rooted in moral anxiety about new technology rather than genuine evidence-based concern. The rise of speedrunning and gaming communities transformed gaming from solitary entertainment into participatory sport. Speedrunners attempted to complete games as quickly as possible, discovering sequence breaks and exploits that game designers never intended. Speedrunning communities emerged around specific games, with runners competing for world records, analyzing frame-by-frame optimizations, and celebrating innovations in technique. Games like Super Metroid, The Legend of Zelda series, and Dark Souls became focal points for speedrunning communities. The culture developed its own hierarchies, heroes, and narratives. Record holders became celebrities within their communities. Speedrunning events were live-streamed to millions of viewers. Speedrunning demonstrated something profound about gaming. Players would engage with games far beyond their conventional completion. The act of exploration, optimization, and mastery became self-sufficient. Beating the game was just the beginning of the journey. Game designers began acknowledging speedrunning, sometimes intentionally designing systems that could be exploited, recognizing that player creativity in discovering unintended uses was valuable. Speedrunning transformed games from finished products into playgrounds for experimentation and optimization. The phenomenon of loot boxes and randomized cosmetics represented gaming's ethical nadir, as developers consciously designed systems exploiting psychological vulnerabilities for profit. By randomizing rewards, developers created variable reward schedules proven effective at generating compulsive behavior. Players spent thousands of dollars chasing cosmetic items, skins, emotes, animations that provided no gameplay advantage. The mechanics paralleled casino slot machines, yet existed outside gambling regulation. Adolescents, whose impulse control was still developing, were particularly vulnerable. Games designed explicitly for children incorporated aggressive monetization systems intended to extract maximum spending from young players. The practice drew scrutiny from regulators, but the industry resisted calls for restrictions. Publishers argued that cosmetics were harmless. Players chose to spend money, no one was forced to participate. Yet the mechanics were designed precisely to induce spending through psychological exploitation. The defense, that participation was voluntary, ignored the reality that games were designed to create perceived social pressure to participate in cosmetic purchasing. Streamers displayed rare cosmetics, players felt social pressure to purchase equivalent items. The system fed itself. The loot box controversy represented a stark demonstration of how commercial incentives could override ethical considerations in game design. The notion of games as art, once controversial, had become mainstream academic and critical consensus by the 2020s. Games like Journey, released in 2012, demonstrated that games could achieve aesthetic sophistication comparable to cinema or visual art. Journey presented a wordless experience of a robed figure traversing a desert toward a mountain, accompanied by a haunting musical score. The game contained no dialogue, minimal mechanical complexity, yet conveyed profound emotional resonance. Players reported crying during the experience. Journey proved that games didn't require complex narratives or challenging gameplay to achieve artistic impact. The medium's unique affordance, interactivity, could be deployed to create deeply moving experiences. Other games followed, each advancing the notion that games could be artistic expressions rather than mere entertainment. The Last of Us, God of War, and numerous others demonstrated that games could rival cinema in narrative sophistication while simultaneously offering interactive agency that film could never achieve. Museums began exhibiting games, universities created game studies departments, critics applied serious literary and artistic analysis to games. Gaming had transcended its entertainment origin to become recognized as a legitimate art form. The concept of choice in narrative games became increasingly complicated as developers struggled to create genuinely consequential player decisions. Early games offered binary choices: take the left path or the right path. Contemporary games attempted more sophisticated narrative branching, where player choices ostensibly determined story outcomes. Games like Detroit, Become Human promised that player decisions would fundamentally reshape the narrative experience. Yet the reality was more complex. Creating genuinely branching narratives required exponential increases in development resources. Most games, despite promises of player choice, followed predetermined narrative rails disguised as choice. Players made decisions that felt impactful but ultimately led to equivalent narrative outcomes. The illusion of agency, choice without genuine consequence, became a standard practice. This raised philosophical questions about the nature of agency and choice in gaming. Was an illusory choice morally equivalent to absence of choice? Did it matter that players believed their choices mattered, even if those choices ultimately had minimal impact? Some games, like the Telltale Adventures, demonstrated that players valued the illusion of choice even when it was illusory. Others, like From Software's games, offered minimal explicit narrative choice while simultaneously offering maximum mechanical agency. The relationship between narrative choice and mechanical agency remained underdeveloped territory in game design theory. The games-as-a-service model, though discussed earlier through Fortnite, represented a fundamental shift in how players related to games they purchased. Rather than owning a discrete product, players increasingly owned access to an ongoing service. This distinction was profound. In the past, a player purchased a game. It was theirs forever. In the service model, the game persisted only as long as the company maintained servers. When publishers shut down server infrastructure, games became unplayable. Entire investments vanished overnight. Companies like Activision and Blizzard operated dozens of online games simultaneously, each requiring constant content updates and server maintenance. The revenue model shifted from one-time purchase to continuous monetization. Monthly battle passes, seasonal cosmetics, and regular content drops created anticipated revenue streams. This predictability appealed to investors and shareholders. It was far preferable to the uncertainty of discrete game sales. Yet the model also created new anxieties for players. Would the game you loved continue existing tomorrow? Would servers be shut down suddenly? Would the game you invested hundreds of hours in become inaccessible? The service model solved the industry's revenue problem but created existential uncertainty for players. This tension between corporate sustainability and player security remained fundamentally unresolved. The introduction of battle passes as a monetization mechanism exemplified how games as a service captured engagement through psychological scaffolding. A battle pass offered seasonal progression, a ladder of cosmetic unlocks earned through gameplay or purchased outright. Players purchased battle passes for approximately $10 per season, with new seasons arriving every few months. The mechanics were carefully designed. Early tiers unlocked quickly, providing dopamine hits and encouraging continued play. Later tiers required extensive engagement. The FOMO, fear of missing out, pushed players to complete the pass before the season ended. Once a season concluded, cosmetics became permanently unavailable, creating artificial scarcity. Players who hadn't completed the pass felt they'd wasted their money. This psychology drove behavioral engagement and spending. The Battle Pass represented a masterpiece of behavioral design. It wasn't explicitly deceptive, yet it exploited psychological vulnerabilities systematically. Players understood intellectually how the mechanics worked, yet remained susceptible to their influence. The Battle Pass model proved so profitable that it spread across the industry. Nearly every online game subsequently adopted seasonal Battle Pass systems. The model generated billions in revenue, yet raised profound questions about whether this kind of psychological manipulation should be considered ethical, even if technically voluntary. The phenomenon of pay-to-win mechanics represented gaming's most ethically fraught monetization strategy. These mechanics allowed players to purchase gameplay advantages, better weapons, enhanced stats, or access to superior content, creating a direct financial-to-competitive advantage conversion. In competitive multiplayer games, pay-to-win mechanics were particularly controversial. A player willing to spend thousands could achieve advantages that no amount of skill could overcome. This violated fundamental notions of competitive fairness. Professional esports leagues banned pay-to-win mechanics for precisely this reason. They undermined the integrity of competition. Yet in casual games and many mobile titles, pay-to-win was ubiquitous. Players with greater financial resources dominated, which seemed unjust yet was ostensibly voluntary. However, voluntary participation didn't resolve the ethical problem. Games designed specifically to exploit whales, players willing to spend exorbitant amounts, created systems where financial privilege directly translated to in-game advantage. The mechanisms were often deliberately obscured through randomized elements and psychological manipulation. The most predatory games explicitly targeted vulnerable populations, adolescents with impulsive control issues, individuals with addiction vulnerabilities, those with disposable income-seeking status. The ethics of designing systems that prey on human psychology for corporate profit remained one of gaming's most unresolved moral problems. Loot boxes, randomized cosmetic or gameplay rewards purchased with real or in-game currency, became symbols of gaming's ethical crisis. The mechanics paralleled slot machines. Players paid money or in-game resources for randomized rewards. The randomization created variable reward schedules proven in behavioral psychology to generate compulsive behavior. Players chased rare cosmetics, spending far more than they intended in pursuit of specific items. The industry defended loot boxes as harmless cosmetics, Yet the marketing and design deliberately obscured how much players could spend. Some games included statistics showing probability rates in tiny print, technically compliant with transparency while practically useless to consumers. Regulators in various jurisdictions began investigating whether loot boxes qualified as gambling. Belgium and the Netherlands declared loot boxes illegal gambling. Other jurisdictions considered restrictions. The industry pushed back aggressively, arguing that participation was voluntary and loot boxes provided no gameplay advantage. Yet the defense ignored the systematic psychological manipulation underlying the mechanics. Games were explicitly designed with addiction psychology in mind. The most damaging aspect was the impact on developing brains. Children and adolescents were frequently exposed to these mechanics without legal protection. The loot box controversy revealed that the gaming industry, despite its creative brilliance, was willing to exploit psychological vulnerabilities systematically for profit maximization. The concept of "cosmetics don't affect gameplay" became a justification for aggressive monetization that obscured a deeper truth. Cosmetics absolutely affected gameplay, just not mechanically. Cosmetics affected social standing, self-expression, and psychological satisfaction. In competitive games, cosmetic rarities signaled achievement and wealth, creating status hierarchies. Players who owned rare cosmetics gained psychological advantages, confidence, and perceived prestige. This was gameplay in the broadest sense. Furthermore, cosmetics often provided practical advantages. Darker skins were harder to see in shooters, animations were more or less flashy depending on cosmetic selection, some cosmetics indicated skill level to opponents. The industry's pretense that cosmetics were purely aesthetic obscured how thoroughly monetization penetrated competitive balance. The most insidious aspect was the normalization of cosmetic purchasing. Younger players, growing up with cosmetic monetization, internalized the idea that games naturally required continuous spending. Expectations shifted. What was once a complete entertainment product was now a perpetually incomplete experience where cosmetics were necessary for social acceptance. The psychological implications were substantial. Gaming became a vehicle for teaching materialistic values, where social worth was purchased rather than earned. The normalization of cosmetic spending represented a subtle but significant shift in gaming culture, where capital became increasingly important to social integration. The Cyberpunk 2077 disaster represented a watershed moment in the relationship between game industry and consumer trust. The game, developed by CD Projekt Red and released in December 2020, was a catastrophic technical failure. The PC version was playable but buggy. The console versions were nearly unplayable. Graphical glitches, physics errors, missing features, and performance issues plagued the release. The game should have been in development for 2 more years. Yet Sony and Microsoft's deadlines, combined with the pandemic's disruptions, forced a premature release. The company had promised it runs surprisingly well on consoles, a statement that proved spectacularly false. Players who purchased the console versions experienced a technically broken game. CD Projekt Red issued apologies and refunds, yet the damage to the company's reputation was irreversible. The Cyberpunk 2077 disaster demonstrated the human cost of industry pressures. The crunch required to meet deadlines had exhausted developers. The game's release was a failure of management, of corporate pressure, of industry expectations. Most significantly, it shattered CD Projekt Red's image as an ethical game company, a perception they had cultivated through anti-DRM stances and free DLC. The disaster revealed that even well-intentioned developers couldn't overcome systemic pressures that demanded impossible deliverables. Cyberpunk 2077 became a symbol of industry dysfunction, a testament to how consumer expectations, shareholder pressure, and developer overwork created conditions for catastrophic failure. Game preservation emerged as a critical cultural concern as older games became increasingly inaccessible. The Library of Congress began formally acquiring video games for archival purposes around 2010, recognizing that games were artistic and cultural artifacts worthy of preservation. Yet preservation faced enormous obstacles. Many games existed only on obsolete hardware, arcade cabinets, cartridge consoles, computers from decades past. Emulation could theoretically allow preservation, yet copyright laws made emulation legally fraught. Companies guarded intellectual property fiercely, preventing communities from preserving games that were no longer commercially available. Nintendo was particularly aggressive, sending cease and desist letters to preservation efforts. The company could easily re-release older games. They chose not to, preferring to gate access through expensive virtual console services. This created a paradox. Culturally significant games, important artistic works, were effectively erased from public access because legal frameworks and corporate power prevented preservation. This raised profound questions about cultural heritage. If game companies were unwilling to preserve and distribute their properties, did society have obligations to preserve them anyway? Legally, consequences be damned? The preservation debate revealed tensions between intellectual property rights and cultural heritage. Future generations might have no access to pivotal games that define the medium, not because preservation was impossible but because legal systems prevented it. The contradiction was stark. We preserved books, films, and music, yet we allowed video games to disappear. The Legend of Ben Drowned, a creepypasta horror story published in 2010, exemplified how gaming communities created and shared mythology around digital experiences. The story depicted a haunted cartridge of The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask, featuring corrupted data, impossible music, and a terrifying reversed mask form. Though entirely fictional, the story resonated deeply with gaming communities. Its power derived from how intimately gamers understood digital glitches, corrupted files, and unexpected behavior. The creepypasta tapped into real anxieties about digital permanence and loss. A corrupted file could destroy irreplaceable memories, could transform beloved games into nightmarish versions of themselves. Ben Drowned became the most famous gaming creepypasta, spawning countless imitators. The phenomenon revealed that gaming communities created folklore, contemporary mythology emerging from shared experiences and collective fears. These stories, though false, contained emotional truths. They reflected genuine anxieties about digital impermanence, about the possibility that the games we loved could become unretrievable, corrupted, or erased. The creepypasta phenomenon also demonstrated gaming's psychological impact. Games were no longer mere entertainment. They were sites of genuine emotional investment where fears and anxieties could crystallize around digital artifacts. The mythology gaming communities created served psychological functions, externalizing fears, processing emotions, creating shared narratives that bound communities together. The Ghost in the Machine mythology, encompassing stories of impossible games, sentient AI, and hidden messages from developers, represented a broader cultural phenomenon of ascribing meaning to digital artifacts. Urban legends circulated about games containing developer messages, Easter eggs that predicted future events, or hidden content accessible only through specific glitches. These legends attributed agency and intentionality to digital systems beyond what was technically possible. They revealed how humans projected consciousness onto machines, seeking meaning in randomness, reading intention into accident. The mythology served multiple psychological functions. It made games feel less mediated, less designed, more alive. It suggested that games contained secrets waiting to be discovered. It created communities of believers seeking hidden truths. Some legends had basis in reality. Developers did include Easter eggs, did hide messages, did experiment with hidden mechanics. Yet the mythology vastly exceeded documented reality. Games were attributed with consciousness and intention they could never possess. This projection of consciousness onto digital systems revealed something profound about human psychology, our tendency to see agency and intention everywhere, to pattern match even when patterns were illusory. The Ghost in the Machine mythology represented modern folklore emerging from gaming communities, contemporary ghost stories told around digital campfires about the supposed consciousness lurking beneath the surface of our entertainment. The rise of content creators, streamers, YouTubers, and social media personalities transformed gaming from private entertainment into public performance and spectacle. Platforms like Twitch, YouTube, and TikTok made it possible for anyone to broadcast themselves playing games to audiences of millions. Top streamers became celebrities, earning millions through sponsorships, donations, and platform revenue sharing. This transformation had profound implications. Games were no longer played primarily for personal enjoyment, they were performed for audiences. Game designers began considering how games would appear on streams, whether they featured moments of dramatic tension, surprising mechanics, or beautiful aesthetics that translated well to visual media. The most successful games were often those that made compelling viewing experiences, not necessarily those with the deepest gameplay. This created new selection pressures in game design. Games became increasingly designed with spectatorship in mind. Competitive games prioritized clarity and excitement. Narrative games prioritized visual spectacle and emotional moments. Sandbox games emphasized creative expression and personalization. The streamification of gaming represented a shift from solitary entertainment toward participatory entertainment. Viewers didn't just watch, they contributed through donations, subscriptions, and chat interactions. Streamers developed parasocial relationships with their audiences, creating communities of followers invested in the streamer's success. This represented a fundamental transformation of gaming culture from private hobby to public performance. The phenomenon of speedrunning culture revealed something profound about gaming communities and human motivation. Speedrunners weren't satisfied with completing games. They obsessively optimized completion, discovering sequence breaks and exploits that developers never intended. Communities formed around specific games, with runners competing for world records measured in fractions of seconds. Games like Super Metroid and Ocarina of Time became focal points for sustained speedrunning communities decades after release. The culture developed its own heroes, narratives, and hierarchies. Record holders became celebrities. Speedrunning events were live-streamed to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The phenomenon revealed that gameplay could sustain engagement long after narrative completion. The act of optimization, of mastery, of pushing boundaries became self-sufficient. Speedrunning also demonstrated how games could inspire deep, sustained engagement. A speedrunner might dedicate thousands of hours to improving their record by milliseconds. This wasn't irrational, it was a pursuit of excellence, a form of artistic expression through movement and execution. Speedrunning communities proved that gaming could inspire the same level of dedication as traditional sports, music, or artistic pursuits. The recognition of speedrunning as legitimate gaming culture, complete with sponsorships and streaming revenue, represented a validation that alternative forms of engagement were equally worthy of investment and attention. The emergence of Souls-like games as a dominant genre revealed something about contemporary gaming culture's shift toward challenging, demanding experiences. Dark Souls had proven that difficulty could be a commercial asset rather than a liability. Yet Souls-like games represented something more, an entire aesthetic and design philosophy that emphasized punishing difficulty, cryptic storytelling, and mechanical precision. Games like Bloodborne, Elden Ring, and Sekiro became critical darlings and commercial successes. Their difficulty attracted a specific audience, players who valued challenge and mastery over accessibility. The success of Souls-likes contradicted industry wisdom that suggested commercial success required broad accessibility. Yet Souls-likes proved that niche audiences with specific aesthetic preferences could drive billion-dollar franchises. The phenomenon also revealed something about how games competed for player attention. In a market saturated with accessible games, Souls-likes differentiated themselves through refusal to compromise on difficulty. This difficulty became the value proposition, the reason to play. The games respected player intelligence and agency by refusing to simplify their design. The Souls-like phenomenon also influenced broader game design. Difficulty settings became more nuanced. Games offered multiple difficulty options rather than binary normal/hard choices. Developers recognized that challenge was a crucial component of engagement for substantial audiences. The next-generation console transition, with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X arriving in 2020, revealed a curious fact. The generational leap was less revolutionary than previous transitions. Graphics improvements were incremental. The technical differences between PS5 and Xbox Series X were minimal. Loading times decreased, but gameplay remained fundamentally similar. The hardware plateau suggested the industry had reached a point where raw processing power offered diminishing returns. A game running at 4K 60 frames per second looked better than 1080p 30 frames per second, but the difference paled compared to the leap from 2D to 3D. This plateau raised questions about where innovation would emerge. If hardware was no longer the limiting factor, innovation would necessarily derive from software. From game design, storytelling, new mechanics, experimental narratives. The industry, however, seemed to struggle with this reality. Many next-gen games looked barely different from previous generation versions. Developers had become comfortable with graphical capabilities and struggled to imagine entirely new design approaches. Some argued that the hardware plateau meant gaming had matured as a medium, that the era of revolutionary innovation had ended. Others suggested that innovation would emerge from entirely new platforms, VR, AR, cloud gaming, rather than traditional console hardware. The question remained open. Would the next decade of gaming be defined by incremental improvements to existing formulas, or would fundamentally new paradigms emerge? The concept of cloud gaming, streaming games from remote servers rather than running them locally on client hardware, promised to democratize gaming by eliminating the need for expensive hardware. Services like Xbox Game Pass for cloud gaming, PlayStation Plus Premium, and NVIDIA GeForce Now offered thousands of games playable on any device with sufficient internet connectivity. The technology was theoretically transformative. Someone with a smartphone could stream AAA games previously requiring expensive consoles. The barrier to entry would collapse. Yet adoption remained limited due to practical obstacles. Latency, the delay between input and response, made real-time gameplay difficult for precision-dependent games. Internet infrastructure in many regions remained inadequate. The streaming model also created new problems: reliance on constant internet connectivity, lack of ownership, vulnerability to service discontinuation. Furthermore, streaming was environmentally expensive. Server farms consumed enormous energy. The promise of cloud gaming as a transformative technology remained largely unfulfilled. Nevertheless, it represented the industry's continued drive toward convenience and accessibility. Eventually, cloud gaming would likely become viable and commonplace, but the transition would be gradual rather than revolutionary. The phenomenon revealed the ongoing tension in gaming between technological possibility and practical limitations, between industry vision and consumer reality. The COVID-19 pandemic's impact on gaming culture represented a watershed moment. As lockdowns forced people indoors, gaming became essential infrastructure for social connection. Online multiplayer games allowed friends to maintain relationships across distance. Games provided psychological respite from isolation and uncertainty. Animal Crossing: New Horizons, released in March 2020, perfectly timed, became a cultural phenomenon, a gentle, peaceful game offering escapism during global turmoil. The game's simple pleasures, collecting items, decorating spaces, visiting friends' islands, provided routine and comfort during unprecedented disruption. For millions, gaming wasn't entertainment, it was survival infrastructure. The pandemic accelerated trends already underway: the shift toward online multiplayer, the growth of streaming platforms, the normalization of gaming across demographics. It also demonstrated gaming's fundamental value as a human activity. Gaming provided joy, connection, and meaning during a period when traditional sources of these experiences were unavailable. The industry's response was rapid. Tournaments moved online, streaming viewership exploded, games explicitly designed for pandemic-era connection flourished. By the pandemic's end, gaming had solidified its position as central infrastructure in contemporary life. The boundary between gamers and non-gamers had blurred beyond recognition. Everyone, effectively, was a gamer. They simply engaged with different games, platforms, and frequencies. The unionization efforts within game development represented gaming's awakening to labor exploitation. For decades, developers worked excessive hours for compensation that didn't reflect their contributions to multi-billion-dollar industries. In 2023, the Game Workers Unite movement gained momentum, with unions organizing at major publishers including Activision Blizzard, Rockstar Games, and Insomniac. The organizing campaigns revealed systematic exploitation, mandatory crunch periods, lack of overtime compensation, sexual harassment, poor working conditions, and unsustainable expectations. Publishers responded with aggressive anti-union tactics, yet momentum continued building. By 2024, multiple studios had successfully unionized. The movement represented a fundamental challenge to the industry's business model, which depended on underpaying creative labor. If unionization succeeded in securing better working conditions and compensation, development costs would increase. This would either reduce publisher profits or necessitate price increases for games. The industry's response, framing unionization as economically destructive, ignored the human cost of the existing system. Developers suffered burnout, left the industry, or sacrificed personal well-being for professional survival. The unionization movement suggested that change was coming, though how radical that change would be remained uncertain. Gaming's most precious resource, creative talent, was increasingly unwilling to accept exploitation, and the industry would eventually be forced to adapt. The emergence of AI-generated content in game development raised profound questions about authenticity, labor, and creative value. Machine learning models trained on existing games could generate new game assets, dialogue, narratives, and even complete game mechanics. Theoretically, AI could reduce development costs by automating routine creative work. Yet AI also displaced human creators and raised questions about who owned AI-generated content. If an AI trained on millions of copyrighted games generated a new game, who deserved credit? This question remained legally and morally unresolved. Furthermore, AI-generated content often carried the biases, stereotypes, and problematic assumptions of the training data. An AI trained on games featuring predominantly masculine protagonists would perpetuate that bias. The integration of AI into game development represented both promise and threat. Promise of faster development and new possibilities, threat of job displacement and homogenization of creative output. The most dangerous application would be AI used to replace human creators entirely, generating endless procedural content that satisfied engagement metrics without genuine creativity. Nevertheless, AI's integration into game development was inevitable. The question was not whether AI would be used but how responsibly and ethically it would be deployed. Would AI augment human creativity or replace it? Would AI democratize game development or concentrate power among those with resources to train and deploy AI systems? The phenomenon of No Man's Sky redemption demonstrated gaming community's capacity for forgiveness and developers' capacity for genuine course correction. No Man's Sky, released in August 2016 to massive critical and commercial disappointment, was a technical disaster. The procedurally generated universe was technically impressive but extraordinarily dull. The promised features, multiplayer, base building, living economies, were largely absent. The game had been overpromised and underdelivered spectacularly. Players felt defrauded, critics tore the game apart. Yet developer Hello Games didn't abandon the game. Instead, they released continuous free updates, adding promised features and fixing problems. For years, they improved the game while receiving minimal public praise. Eventually, as updates accumulated, No Man's Sky transformed into something approaching the initially promised experience. By 2024, the game was largely respected. The redemption arc was remarkable. A failed launch became a triumph through sustained effort. No Man's Sky's redemption suggested that failure wasn't permanent, that developers could recover from catastrophic mistakes through dedication and effort. It also demonstrated gaming community's potential for generosity. Players could forgive spectacular failures if genuine effort to fix problems was evident. The redemption offered some counterpoint to the Cyberpunk 2077 disaster, suggesting that outcomes depended on how companies responded to failure rather than failure itself. The integration of neural interfaces and brain-computer interfaces into gaming represented the theoretical frontier of player engagement. Companies like Neuralink proposed systems allowing direct brain-to-computer communication, theoretically offering instantaneous input without traditional controllers. Neural interfaces could potentially map brain states to game events, creating unprecedented immersion. Yet the prospect also raised profound ethical and practical concerns. Neural interfaces would require invasive surgery. The technology's long-term effects were unknown. The potential for manipulation through direct neural access was terrifying. Furthermore, neural interfaces represented ultimate exploitation potential, games designed to exploit neural reward pathways directly, creating addiction at biological levels rather than psychological. The discussion of neural interfaces often existed in science fiction territory, yet the technology was advancing rapidly. Whether neural interfaces would ever become mainstream gaming technology remains speculative. Yet their possibility represented gaming's ongoing drive toward greater immersion and more direct engagement. The trajectory suggested that gaming would continue evolving toward more intimate forms of player engagement, whether through improved graphics, more natural controls, or eventually, direct neural connections. The phenomenon of social gaming and metagaming revealed how games functioned as social infrastructure beyond their mechanical gameplay. Fortnite, for instance, functioned as a social platform as much as a game. Players gathered to see concerts, attend events, and socialize with friends, with the actual game mechanics almost secondary. Similarly, games like Roblox and Minecraft functioned as creation platforms where users built and shared experiences. This evolution suggested that the boundary between games, social networks, and creative platforms was dissolving. Gaming was becoming infrastructure for social connection, creative expression, and shared cultural experience. The implications were profound. Games were no longer primarily entertainment. They were becoming essential platforms for human connection and identity formation. This transformation had both liberatory and exploitative potential. Liberatory, because it meant gaming could facilitate connection across geographic boundaries, could democratize creative expression, could build communities around shared interests. Exploitative, because it meant companies could monetize social connection itself, could extract value from user-generated content, could profit from human relationships mediated through their platforms. The question of gaming's environmental impact received increasing attention as the industry's energy consumption became more visible. Data centers powering cloud gaming, cryptocurrency-based games, and blockchain integration consumed enormous energy. Some estimates suggested gaming's energy consumption was comparable to small nations. The environmental cost of gaming production, manufacturing consoles, producing physical game copies, shipping goods globally, was substantial. Furthermore, the planned obsolescence of gaming hardware created e-waste. Yet the industry barely acknowledged environmental concerns. Games celebrated environmental themes while their production was environmentally destructive. This hypocrisy suggested that the gaming industry, like most contemporary industries, prioritized profit over environmental sustainability. Future generations might view gaming's environmental cost as indefensible, a luxury that contributed to planetary degradation for entertainment. The contradiction was stark. Games explored environmental themes, post-apocalyptic wastelands, dying ecosystems, while gaming itself contributed to environmental destruction. The industry's failure to address this contradiction represented a fundamental ethical failure. As environmental crisis intensified, gaming's environmental cost would likely become increasingly contentious. The rise of accessibility features in games represented genuine progress toward inclusive design. Games began including features for players with disabilities, colorblind modes, remappable controls, text-to-speech systems, adjustable difficulty, and numerous other accommodations. Games like The Last of Us Part 2 included extensive accessibility options that allowed people with various disabilities to experience the narrative. This represented recognition that gaming was for everyone, not just able-bodied players. The progress was significant, yet still insufficient. Many games continued excluding disabled players through poor design or absent accessibility options. Furthermore, accessibility often felt like an afterthought rather than core design principle. Yet the trend was toward greater inclusion. Disabled communities began demanding accessibility, and progressive developers recognized that accessibility benefited everyone. Ramp designs benefit wheelchair users and parents with strollers. Subtitle options help deaf and hard-of-hearing players and also help players in loud environments or for whom English wasn't native. Colorblind modes help colorblind players and also improve visual clarity generally. Accessibility, when implemented thoughtfully, improved games for everyone. The integration of accessibility into game design represented a gradual shift toward recognizing that universal design benefited all users. The phenomenon of walking simulators and narrative-focused experiences represented gaming's ongoing expansion beyond action and competition. Games like Firewatch, Outer Wilds, and What Remains of Edith Finch prioritized narrative, atmosphere, and exploration over mechanical challenge. These games offered minimal traditional gameplay mechanics yet achieved profound emotional resonance. Walking simulators demonstrated that games could be contemplative, meditative, and focused on personal reflection. They proved that challenge and action weren't essential to meaningful gaming experiences. This expansion of gaming's expressive palette suggested that the medium was maturing beyond its origin as competition-focused entertainment. Games could be poetry, could explore internal emotional landscapes, could facilitate personal reflection and growth. The mainstream adoption of walking simulators and narrative-focused games indicated that broader audiences valued these experiences. Yet the industry's commercial incentives still heavily favored action games and competitive titles, which generated larger audiences and greater monetization opportunities. The tension between commercial viability and artistic expression remained unresolved. Nevertheless, the existence of successful walking simulators demonstrated that markets for contemplative games existed, that diverse audiences valued diverse experiences. The question of gaming's representation of gender, race, and sexuality remained contentious and incompletely resolved. Gaming's history featured predominantly white, heterosexual, male protagonists. Women in games were frequently hypersexualized, relegated to supporting roles, or entirely absent. Racial and ethnic diversity was minimal, LGBTQ+ representation was rare. Yet progress was visible. Games like Horizon Zero Dawn featured female protagonists. Games like The Last of Us Part 2 featured LGBTQ+ relationships. Indie games explored diverse perspectives and identities. Mainstream AAA games, however, remained predominantly focused on white male protagonists. The industry's cautious approach to representation reflected perceived commercial risks, the false belief that diverse protagonists would alienate audiences. Yet markets for games with diverse representation clearly existed. The resistance to representation wasn't based on market reality but on the biases and assumptions of industry gatekeepers. Furthermore, representation mattered. Young people saw themselves reflected in the games they played, or notably absent. Gaming's cultural influence meant representation had real consequences for how players understood themselves and others. The expansion of diverse representation in games was both a justice issue and a market opportunity. Progressive developers recognized that inclusive games reached broader audiences while also doing the ethical work of representation. The industry's slow progress on representation represented a failure to fully embrace gaming's potential as a medium for empathy and perspective-taking. The phenomenon of games criticism as serious academic and journalistic practice represented gaming's maturation as a cultural medium. Universities created game studies programs. Scholars published peer-reviewed research on games. Major publications assigned serious critics to game reviews. This represented recognition that games deserved critical attention comparable to literature, film, or music. Yet games criticism remained marginalized compared to other media criticism. Gaming journalism was often dismissive of critical analysis, privileging reviews that evaluated mechanical enjoyment over deeper analysis. Furthermore, games criticism frequently faced harassment from communities resistant to critical examination. Critics who questioned problematic representations or exploitative mechanics faced coordinated attacks. The Gamergate harassment campaign of 2014 represented a nadir, where critics, particularly women and people of color, faced coordinated harassment for suggesting that gaming culture needed self-examination. Despite the hostile environment, games criticism persisted. Critics explored how games constructed narratives, represented identity, shaped player psychology, and reflected cultural values. This critical practice elevated gaming discourse and encouraged developers to consider the deeper implications of their designs. Nevertheless, games criticism remained embattled, with significant portions of gaming communities hostile to critical examination. The tension between celebration of gaming and critical examination of its problems remained unresolved. The rise of queer gaming as a recognized subculture and game design space represented gaming's increasing recognition of diverse identities and perspectives. Games exploring LGBTQ+ themes, designed by queer developers, and celebrating queer identities proliferated. Games like Celeste, with its exploration of transgender identity and mental health, became beloved, suggesting that queer narratives had substantial audiences. The emergence of explicitly queer game developers like EVB demonstrated that queer perspectives were bringing new creative energy to the medium. Queer gaming represented more than representation. It represented fundamentally different approaches to game design. Queer developers often prioritized emotional authenticity over mechanical complexity, narrative depth over competitive gameplay, personal expression over commercial viability. This aesthetic brought valuable diversity to gaming design. Yet queer gaming remained marginalized within mainstream gaming. Major publishers rarely prioritized queer narratives. Queer games often existed in indie spaces with limited visibility and funding. Furthermore, queer gaming communities faced hostile environments from conservative gaming factions resistant to LGBTQ+ representation. Nevertheless, the existence and growth of queer gaming demonstrated that the medium could be a vehicle for authentic representation and self-expression for marginalized communities. The question of gaming's narrative potential relative to other media remained actively debated. Games offered something film and literature could not: interactive agency, the ability for players to shape story outcomes. Yet games also faced unique constraints: the challenge of maintaining narrative coherence while offering meaningful choice, the difficulty of pacing when players control progression, the problem of aligning character motivation with player choice. Some argued that games were fundamentally superior to other media for narrative because of their interactive nature. Others suggested that games struggled to match cinema's emotional power or literature's psychological depth because interactivity interfered with carefully crafted narrative. The truth likely lay in between. Games were capable of profound narrative experiences, but the narrative potential was distinct from other media rather than superior or inferior. The most successful game narratives leveraged interactivity as a narrative tool rather than treating it as incidental to storytelling. Games like Undertale, which made player choices fundamental to the narrative, demonstrated how interactivity could deepen emotional impact. Conversely, games that treated narrative and gameplay as separate experiences, with cutscenes interrupting mechanical play, often failed to integrate the two effectively. The frontier of game narrative design involved discovering how to meaningfully integrate player choice, mechanical systems, and storytelling into cohesive artistic experiences. The phenomenon of player-generated content and modding communities demonstrated gaming's potential as a participatory medium. Players used tools like Creation Kit for Skyrim to build elaborate modifications, creating entirely new quests, locations, and mechanics. Some games existed primarily as foundations for community creativity. Skyrim was arguably equally valued for its modding community as its base game. This participatory aspect represented something cinema or literature couldn't match: audiences becoming co-creators, extending and transforming the original work. Modding communities demonstrated that players wanted creative agency beyond mechanical gameplay. They wanted to build worlds, tell stories, express themselves through game modification. The most progressive developers embraced modding, understanding that community creativity extended their game's lifespan and added value. Yet many developers restricted modding through copyright claims, technical limitations, or prohibitive licensing. The tension between developers controlling their intellectual property and communities exercising creative agency remained largely unresolved. Nevertheless, modding demonstrated an important truth: players wanted to be co-creators, not merely consumers. The most vibrant gaming communities were those where players had tools and permission to modify and extend games. The rise of indie darlings like Hades, Celeste, and Hollow Knight demonstrated that game quality and commercial success didn't require massive budgets. These games, developed by small teams on modest budgets, achieved critical acclaim and millions in sales. They demonstrated that creativity, focus, and clarity of vision could outweigh production values. Indie developers often took creative risks mainstream publishers wouldn't consider, exploring unconventional mechanics, unusual narratives, and experimental aesthetics. The indie game movement represented a challenge to AAA dominance, proving that viable alternatives existed. Yet indie developers faced their own pressures. The low barrier to entry meant millions of games competed for attention. Most achieved minimal visibility. Success required not just quality but also luck and marketing savvy. Furthermore, as successful indie developers grew and scaled, they often faced the same pressures that corrupted larger companies. Studios that began with artistic visions sometimes became focused on chasing market trends and maximizing monetization. The indie gaming movement remained important for demonstrating alternatives to AAA formulas, yet the sustainability of indie success remained fragile. As the indie space became increasingly crowded, developers faced pressure to pursue commercial viability at the expense of artistic experimentation. The question of gaming's relationship to truth and reality became increasingly complex in an age of metaverse speculation and virtual worlds. Games created simulated realities where players experienced consequences of their choices, suffered setbacks, achieved victories. Yet games' simulated realities differed fundamentally from physical reality. Games could be reset, progress could be reset to earlier states, death was reversible. This difference between game reality and physical reality was crucial. Games offered consequence without permanent stakes. This made them valuable laboratories for exploring moral choices and experiencing alternative outcomes. Yet the distinction between simulation and reality could blur. Players invested enormous time and emotion into virtual achievements. Losses in games felt genuinely painful. The line between game experience and lived experience became increasingly ambiguous. Furthermore, as games increasingly functioned as social infrastructure, the consequences of actions within games became more real. Losing a competitive match might result in real humiliation. In-game social exclusion reflected real social damage. The notion that games were just games, with no real consequences, became increasingly untenable. Games created real social, emotional, and sometimes financial consequences. The question of how to interpret games' relationship to reality remained open, yet it became increasingly clear that games weren't separate from reality but deeply woven into contemporary life. The phenomenon of speedrunning culture evolved beyond gaming into mainstream recognition. Speedrunning events like Games Done Quick raised millions for charity while demonstrating gaming skill and optimization. Speedrunners achieved celebrity status. Sponsorships made speedrunning viable careers. The Games Done Quick summer and winter events became annual television spectacles, with hundreds of thousands watching simultaneously. Speedrunning revealed that gaming communities could organize around shared values: the pursuit of excellence, the celebration of skill, the commitment to optimization. Yet speedrunning also revealed gaming's potential for obsessive behavior. Top speedrunners dedicated thousands of hours to improving their records by milliseconds. While the dedication was admirable, it also raised questions about whether this level of engagement was healthy. The line between passionate engagement and destructive obsession remained unclear. Nevertheless, speedrunning demonstrated that gaming could inspire deep commitment and skill development. Speedrunners trained with the dedication of professional athletes, developed sophisticated strategies, and pushed the boundaries of what was mechanically possible. The integration of blockchain technology and NFTs into gaming represented a controversial and largely failed experiment. Blockchain advocates promoted NFTs, non-fungible tokens representing digital ownership, as revolutionary technology enabling true digital ownership and player-to-player trading. Games incorporated blockchain systems where players owned digital assets as NFTs. Theoretically, this offered player benefits: true ownership of in-game items, ability to trade across games, protection against account loss. Practically, blockchain gaming was plagued with problems. Environmental destruction from energy-intensive proof-of-work systems, financial speculation detached from gameplay value, scams and fraudulent schemes, and generally poor gameplay. Furthermore, the promise that blockchain-enabled true ownership was largely false. Players owned tokens. The game companies still controlled the servers and could delete accounts. The blockchain gaming experiment largely failed commercially and culturally. Most players rejected blockchain gaming as extractive, environmentally destructive, and fundamentally incompatible with good game design. By 2024, blockchain gaming had largely retreated to margins. The failed experiment demonstrated that technological innovation doesn't automatically improve games. Adding blockchain to games didn't make them better, it made them worse. The contradiction between environmental destruction and the entertainment value provided revealed that some innovations shouldn't be pursued regardless of theoretical potential. The phenomenon of esports professionalization transformed gaming from hobby to legitimate sport. Professional esports leagues operated with franchises, salary caps, and multi-million-dollar prize pools. Games like League of Legends, Dota 2, and Counter-Strike created professional ecosystems where players could sustain careers. The international Dota 2's annual championship featured prize pools exceeding $30 million. Professional esports became televised, with major sports broadcasters covering tournaments. This professionalization validated gaming skill and dedication but also created new problems. The pressure on professional players mirrored traditional sports. Injury risk from repetitive stress, psychological pressure, exploitation of young players without legal protections, unsustainable working conditions. Furthermore, esports success was distributed unevenly. Only players at the highest levels could sustain careers. The professionalization also created perverse incentives for game design. Games designed for competitive play were optimized for viewership and revenue, not for balanced gameplay. Developers balanced games around professional tournament viability rather than casual player experience. Nevertheless, esports professionalization demonstrated that gaming skill merited recognition and compensation comparable to traditional sports. The question of gaming's relationship to gambling and addiction receiving increased regulatory attention as governments recognized problematic mechanics. China implemented restrictions on gaming time for minors. Loot boxes faced investigation as gambling. Some jurisdictions implemented taxes on gaming revenue. Regulatory frameworks struggled to keep pace with industry innovation. By the time regulations were drafted, companies had already evolved to circumvent them. The fundamental challenge was that effective regulation required fundamental changes to business models that depended on exploitation. Regulators would eventually be forced to choose: either accept gaming's extractive monetization practices or mandate fundamental changes to game design. The gaming industry's lobbying power was substantial. Real regulatory change faced enormous resistance. Nevertheless, the trajectory was clear: scrutiny of gaming industry practices would intensify. Public health concerns about gaming addiction, particularly among young people, would eventually demand regulatory response. The question was not whether regulation would come but how stringent that regulation would be. The emergence of game preservation societies and communities dedicated to maintaining gaming history represented grassroots efforts to preserve games against industry indifference. The Video Game History Foundation, Internet Archive's Software Preservation Initiative, and countless community efforts worked to ensure gaming's cultural heritage survived. These efforts operated in legal gray areas, sometimes violating copyright law to preserve inaccessible games. The contradiction was stark. Companies that owned games were unwilling to preserve them. Preservation required breaking laws companies had written. This revealed fundamental dysfunction in copyright frameworks. Intellectual property protections served corporate interests but harmed cultural preservation. As digital media became increasingly ephemeral, the inability to preserve cultural works became a genuine crisis. Games released decades ago were becoming irretrievable. The industry's refusal to release these games for preservation purposes meant that future generations would have incomplete access to gaming's history. The preservation question raised uncomfortable truths about how societies balanced property rights against cultural heritage. Eventually, legal frameworks would need to change to allow preservation without violating copyright. Until then, preservation efforts would remain in legal limbo, working against corporate interests to preserve cultural heritage. The phenomenon of games about grief emerged as developers explored emotional depth previously rare in gaming. Games like What Remains of Edith Finch, Gree, and Journey explored loss, sorrow, and human mortality. These games demonstrated that games could facilitate emotional experiences comparable to the most affecting literature or cinema. The emergence of games about grief represented gaming's maturation as an artistic medium. Rather than exclusively pursuing excitement and challenge, games could explore quiet, contemplative emotional states. The commercial success of grief-focused games demonstrated that audiences valued these experiences. Furthermore, grief games served psychological functions. They allowed players to process their own losses through proxy experiences. They validated emotions that society often marginalized. They created spaces where sorrow was honored rather than minimized. The emergence of emotionally sophisticated game design suggested that gaming's expressive potential extended far beyond entertainment. Games could be therapeutic, could facilitate emotional growth, could honor human experiences often overlooked in commercial entertainment. The question of gaming's future in relation to augmented reality and mixed reality became increasingly relevant as AR technology improved. Pokémon Go demonstrated AR gaming's mainstream potential, with hundreds of millions of players capturing virtual creatures overlaid on physical space. As AR hardware improved, Microsoft's HoloLens, Apple's Vision Pro, AR gaming would become increasingly sophisticated. The potential for mixing virtual and physical experiences offered unprecedented possibilities. Yet AR gaming also raised concerns. Privacy implications of AR systems capturing physical environments, the transformation of public space into augmented gaming territory, the distraction and safety risks of AR navigation. Nevertheless, AR represented a likely frontier for gaming's evolution. Rather than replacing physical reality with virtual worlds, AR integrated virtual elements into physical space. This integration offered possibilities for gaming that transcended traditional mediums. Yet it also risked instrumentalizing physical space for corporate interests. Public spaces could be transformed into branded gaming territories where corporations controlled the AR layer. The tension between AR's liberatory potential and its exploitative possibilities would shape gaming's evolution. The rise of toxic gaming communities and the relationship between gaming culture and radicalization became increasingly concerning. Gaming communities sometimes functioned as radicalization pipelines, where online harassment normalized extreme ideologies. Gamergate demonstrated how gaming communities could organize around regressive causes. Furthermore, extremist groups recognized gaming communities as recruitment vectors. The anonymity and community identity of gaming provided conditions where extremism could flourish. Gaming culture's historical association with masculinity and male dominance created susceptibility to misogynistic and white supremacist ideologies. The industry largely ignored the problem, refusing to acknowledge gaming communities' radicalization. Some argued that games themselves promoted toxic behavior, others blamed communities rather than games. The reality was complex. Some gaming culture fostered toxicity, yet games themselves weren't inherently radicalizing. The issue required honest examination of how gaming communities functioned as social spaces where radicalization could occur. Progressive communities demonstrated that gaming spaces could be explicitly anti-toxic, could celebrate inclusion, could actively combat extremism. Yet major gaming companies often avoided these conversations, treating toxicity as inevitable rather than addressable. The phenomenon of gaming nostalgia revealed how players' emotional relationships with games could extend decades. Games people played in childhood achieved disproportionate emotional significance. Remakes and remasters of beloved games sold enormously, sometimes achieving greater success than original releases. The success of the Final Fantasy VII Remake demonstrated nostalgia's commercial power. Yet nostalgia could also distort perception. Beloved games replayed years later, sometimes disappointed. Memory often improved upon reality. Furthermore, nostalgia marketing commodified emotional attachment, extracting value from players' affective bonds with games. Companies released remakes and remasters less from artistic impulse than from recognition that nostalgia was marketable. The exploitation of nostalgia represented a mild version of exploitation through psychological manipulation. Companies profited from emotional attachment they hadn't created. Nevertheless, gaming nostalgia revealed something important: games' power to create lasting emotional bonds. Games people played in formative years shaped how they understood the world. The games of one generation became the cultural touchstones of another. Gaming nostalgia represented the accumulation of gaming as a cultural practice spanning decades, with multiple generations recognizing gaming's significance in their lives. The question of gaming's educational potential received increasing academic attention. Games could teach problem-solving, strategic thinking, historical knowledge, and emotional intelligence. Educational games existed but remained marginal within mainstream gaming. The challenge was that educational content often felt separate from engaging gameplay. The most successful educational games integrated learning into compelling mechanics rather than treating education and entertainment as distinct categories. Minecraft, though not explicitly educational, became widely used in schools precisely because it was engaging. Players learned through exploration and experimentation rather than explicit instruction. This suggested that effective educational gaming required prioritizing engagement and fun rather than content delivery. Furthermore, gaming's potential for education extended beyond academic knowledge. Games could teach empathy through perspective-taking, they could explore historical events through simulation, they could develop problem-solving skills through engagement with complex systems. Yet the industry largely ignored education as a serious market. Gamers and educators remained somewhat separate communities, with limited overlap. If the gap could be bridged, gaming could revolutionize education. The potential remained largely unrealized. The emergence of parasocial relationships with game characters and streamers represented a new form of human connection mediated through digital systems. Players formed emotional attachments to NPCs in games. Fans developed intense relationships with streamers they watched. These relationships were asymmetrical. The character or streamer didn't know the player, yet players invested genuine emotion. Parasocial relationships weren't new, but gaming enabled them at unprecedented scale. Millions could simultaneously form relationships with the same streamer or character. This democratized celebrity in new ways. Additionally, parasocial relationships served psychological functions. They provided companionship, modeled social interaction, created sense of community. For isolated individuals, parasocial relationships could be survival infrastructure. Yet they also posed risks. Players sometimes confused parasocial relationships with genuine friendship. Streamers exploited parasocial relationships for financial gain, manipulating emotional bonds for sponsorships and donations. The psychological implications of parasocial relationships mediated through digital systems remained understudied. Nevertheless, it was clear that gaming and streaming created new forms of human connection, for better and worse. The phenomenon of games that make you cry represented gaming's emotional maturity. Games like The Last of Us, Journey, and Spiritfarer achieved emotional resonance comparable to the most affecting art. These games proved that games could create cathartic emotional experiences. The existence of games that moved players to tears demonstrated something profound. Games could explore human emotion with sophistication and depth. Furthermore, the fact that players sought out emotional games suggested that emotional engagement was valuable to them. People didn't play these games expecting entertainment, they played expecting emotional experiences. This revealed a fundamental aspect of why people played games, not just for fun or challenge but for emotional engagement. Games provided spaces where emotions could be experienced, processed, and honored. The emergence of emotionally sophisticated games suggested that gaming was maturing beyond its origin as pure entertainment towards something more like art. The question of artificial consciousness and sentient AI in games remained firmly in speculative territory while nevertheless generating serious philosophical discussion. If games created sufficiently sophisticated AI NPCs, would those NPCs possess consciousness? Would they deserve moral consideration? These questions seemed absurd yet revealed important philosophical issues. As AI systems became more sophisticated, the boundary between simulated and genuine consciousness would blur. Whether that boundary was philosophically meaningful remained unclear. Nevertheless, the discussion revealed that gaming communities were engaging with profound philosophical questions about consciousness, agency, and moral status. The potential for games to explore philosophical questions through simulation offered something unique to gaming. Players could experiment with thought experiments, could experience moral dilemmas, could explore philosophical implications. Whether games would ever seriously explore these possibilities remained uncertain. The rise of game mods as art represented how player creativity transformed games into vehicles for artistic expression. Modders created entirely new experiences within games' frameworks, new stories, new mechanics, new aesthetics. Some mods achieved recognition as serious art. The community recognized that modding was creative work deserving of appreciation alongside original game development. Yet the industry largely treated modders as labor to exploit, recognizing modding's value yet compensating modders minimally. Furthermore, many games restricted modding through copyright claims or technical limitations. This represented a failure to recognize and support player creativity. The most progressive approach acknowledged that player modifications extended and enriched games, that modding communities were valuable assets. Yet most companies remained protective of control, preferring to own rather than share creative possibilities with communities. The phenomenon of player-created economies within games revealed how games could simulate and explore economic systems. Games like EVE Online created sophisticated economies where players' economic choices had meaningful impact. These player economies sometimes generated real-world economic insights. Economists studied EVE Online's economy to understand real economic behaviors. This demonstrated that games could serve as laboratories for exploring complex systems. Furthermore, player-created economies revealed something about human nature. People naturally created markets, traded items, accumulated wealth. Games channeled these impulses into harmless environments. Yet they also normalized economic competition and accumulation. Players internalized capitalist logic through gameplay. Whether games should celebrate or critique economic systems they simulated remained underdeveloped territory. The question of gaming's relationship to solitude and social connection remained complex. Gaming could be deeply solitary, a single player engaging with a game in isolation. Yet it could also be profoundly social. Multiplayer games created spaces for connection. Gaming communities provided belonging. Different people engaged with gaming differently. For some, gaming was escape from social demands. For others, it was primary mechanism for social connection. The pandemic revealed both possibilities. Gaming allowed isolated people to maintain connection, while also providing escape from difficult realities. The question of whether gaming promoted or inhibited social connections seemed to depend entirely on how people engaged with it. Gaming itself was neutral, its social implications depended on surrounding cultural practices. The emergence of game design documentaries and deep analysis of game development demonstrated increasing sophistication of game study scholarship. Documentaries exploring game design philosophy, developer decision-making, and creative processes elevated discourse around games. They revealed that game design was serious creative work deserving of respect and analysis. Furthermore, they provided transparency into how games were created, demystifying the process. This accessibility encouraged new developers and helped players understand the constraints and choices underlying their favorite games. The growth of game studies as academic field and game documentaries as media genre suggested that gaming was being increasingly recognized as serious cultural practice worthy of scholarly attention. The question of gaming's future in relation to physical experience and embodied gameplay remained open. While most gaming remained mediated through controllers and screens, some explored embodied gaming, using the body as primary interface. Dance games, motion-controlled games, and experimental performance-based games explored how movement could be primary gameplay element. VR offered unprecedented embodied engagement. Yet despite potential, most gaming remained screen-based. The question was whether embodied gaming would become mainstream or remain niche. The trajectory of technology suggested increasing sophistication in bodily interfaces. Nevertheless, the most commercially viable games remained those requiring minimal physical engagement. The industry's preferences for accessibility and broad appeal pushed away from demanding embodied gameplay. The phenomenon of games about games represented metacritical engagement where games explored gaming itself. Games like Undertale, Spec Ops, The Line, and Stanley Parable critiqued gaming conventions and explored gaming's nature as medium. These games made gaming's artificiality explicit, questioned player agency, and examined the ethical implications of player choices. By making the medium itself subject of critical examination, these games demonstrated that gaming could be self-reflective. Furthermore, they suggested that critical examination of gaming was possible from within games rather than only external criticism. Yet such metacritical games remained relatively rare. The industry's commercial incentives pushed toward straightforward entertainment rather than self-critical examination. Nevertheless, the existence of such games demonstrated that gaming could accommodate serious self-reflection. The rise of games with no combat, or pacifist games, revealed an important truth: violence wasn't essential to engaging gameplay. Games like Abzu, Journey, and Flower demonstrated that beauty, exploration, and contemplation could sustain engagement without combat or challenge. The success of these games demonstrated that audiences valued diverse gameplay experiences. Furthermore, they suggested that the historical association of gaming with violence was contingent rather than essential. Games could be peaceful, they could celebrate non-aggression, they could explore quiet experiences. The existence of successful non-violent games challenged the notion that exciting gameplay required conflict. Nevertheless, combat-focused games remained dominant commercially. The industry's investment in violent gameplay suggested that violence remained primary value driver. Yet the existence of alternatives demonstrated that markets existed for gentler experiences. The question of gaming and mental health achieved increasing attention from researchers and mental health professionals. Gaming could provide therapeutic benefits, stress relief, coping mechanisms, community connection. Yet excessive gaming could contribute to depression, anxiety, and social isolation. The relationship was complex and individual. Some people found gaming deeply beneficial, others found it harmful. The challenge was that gaming culture often dismissed concerns about negative mental health impacts while simultaneously celebrating gaming's therapeutic potential. Honest assessment required acknowledging both benefits and harms. Furthermore, it required examining how games were designed to encourage problematic engagement. Games incorporating addiction mechanics deliberately exploited psychological vulnerabilities. Responsible game design would prioritize player well-being over engagement metrics and monetization. The phenomenon of gaming as resistance revealed how marginalized communities used games as tools for expressing identity and resisting dominant power structures. Queer games celebrated LGBTQ+ identities in spaces often hostile to such expression. Games by and for people of color explored racial identity and resistance. Games by disabled developers centered disability experience. These games represented creative resistance to mainstream gaming's marginalization of diverse identities. Furthermore, they created spaces where marginalized people could see themselves reflected in gaming. The existence of resistant gaming demonstrated that gaming could be a vehicle for cultural expression and political resistance. Yet such games remained marginalized within mainstream gaming industry. The industry's commercial incentives pushed toward products appealing to largest possible audiences, which meant avoiding controversial content. Resistant games often existed in indie spaces with limited visibility and funding. The rise of gaming influencers and gaming celebrities transformed gaming from solitary hobby into spectator sport with celebrities and fan bases. Top gaming streamers commanded audiences in millions, gaming celebrities earned enormous incomes, fans followed gaming personalities with fervor reserved for traditional celebrities. This transformation revealed something about contemporary culture. Celebrity status could be achieved through gaming performance and community building. Furthermore, it revealed gaming communities' desire for leadership and models. Gaming influencers provided community anchors, established norms, and shaped discourse. Yet this power was largely unaccountable. Influencers could spread harmful ideologies, exploit followers, promote predatory games. The lack of accountability suggested that gaming culture needed mechanisms to address influencer abuse of power. Nevertheless, the rise of gaming influencers demonstrated gaming's cultural significance and the appetite for gaming-related content and community. The question of gaming's future relationship to political and social commentary became increasingly relevant as games engaged with contemporary issues. Games exploring systemic racism, environmental destruction, political corruption, and social inequality demonstrated that games could address serious subjects. Games like Parable of the Polygons and Papers, Please used game mechanics to explore complex social issues. Yet the gaming industry remained largely apolitical or explicitly conservative. Commercial pressures pushed developers away from controversial political content. Furthermore, gaming communities were often hostile to political commentary in games, preferring games that avoided challenging player assumptions. The question was whether games would increasingly engage with political and social issues or whether commercial pressures would maintain gaming's largely apolitical character. The potential for games to explore social issues existed. Whether that potential would be realized remained uncertain. The phenomenon of games as therapy revealed emerging clinical applications of games in mental health treatment. Games were being used to treat anxiety, depression, PTSD, and other conditions. Gamification of therapy made treatment more engaging. Games created safe spaces for exploring trauma and practicing coping mechanisms. The clinical application of games represented recognition of gaming's psychological power for therapeutic rather than exploitative purposes. Yet the field remained relatively underdeveloped. Most therapeutic gaming applications were experimental. The industry had invested far more in exploitative mechanics than therapeutic ones. If gaming's psychological power could be systematically applied toward mental health, the potential would be enormous. Yet doing so would require fundamentally different design philosophy than current commercial gaming. The rise of gaming communities as social infrastructure revealed how games functioned as primary locations for social connection and community building. For millions, gaming communities provided belonging, friendship, and purpose. Guilds, clans, and Discord communities created social bonds as significant as physical world friendships. This transformation of gaming from solitary hobby into social infrastructure demonstrated gaming's profound impact on contemporary social life. For socially isolated individuals, gaming communities could be survival infrastructure. Yet the dependence on corporate-controlled platforms raised concerning questions. Communities existed only as long as companies maintained servers. Players had no real agency. Companies could manipulate communities for profit. The transformation of social connection into corporate-controlled platforms represented a troubling shift in how humans connected. The question of gaming's future in the context of climate crisis and environmental destruction became increasingly urgent. Gaming's environmental cost would likely become increasingly visible as climate impacts intensified. Furthermore, the notion that entertainment was justifiable in face of ecological collapse would be increasingly questioned. Gaming culture's environmental obliviousness suggested that serious reckoning was coming. Whether the industry would adapt responsibly or resist environmental accountability remained uncertain. Nevertheless, the trajectory was clear: gaming's environmental impact would eventually be impossible to ignore. The phenomenon of games as shared experience during the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated gaming's potential as collective cultural event. Games released during lockdown became communal touchstones. Millions played the same game simultaneously, creating shared experiences across geographic and social boundaries. This shared gaming experience revealed something profound about gaming's potential. Games could be vehicles for collective experience, cultural meaning-making, and shared identity. The notion of games as solitary entertainment was outdated. Contemporary gaming was increasingly social and collective. This transformation represented gaming's maturation as cultural practice capable of generating shared meaning comparable to traditional media. The rise of game design as liberal education revealed how game design could teach critical thinking and systems analysis. Students learning game design learned to understand complex systems, to iterate rapidly, to balance competing values. These skills transferred beyond gaming into general problem solving. Furthermore, game design education introduced players to game design's actual complexity, demystifying games and encouraging critical engagement. The potential for game design education to develop critical thinking suggested that gaming could contribute to intellectual development. Yet such education remained relatively rare. Most players and most game design education focused on commercial viability rather than critical understanding. The question of what would replace gaming if the medium disappeared seemed absurd yet was worth considering. What needs did gaming fulfill? Entertainment, certainly, but also connection, creativity, competition, exploration, and meaning-making. If gaming disappeared, what would satisfy these needs? The answer suggested that gaming fulfilled fundamental human needs. Unless those needs disappeared, some form of interactive entertainment would arise to satisfy them. Gaming was fundamentally sustainable because it addressed core aspects of human psychology. Games were unlikely to disappear. They might evolve beyond recognition, but the core appeal, the ability to engage with meaningful challenges in safe spaces, was too central to human experience to abandon. We find ourselves at the threshold of gaming's next era, though what emerges remains genuinely uncertain. The trajectory of gaming's evolution has been one of increasing integration into daily life, increasing sophistication in how it captures engagement, and increasingly complex relationships between entertainment, exploitation, and human well-being. The questions gaming culture faces in the coming years, questions of labor, representation, environmental sustainability, psychological well-being, and the ethics of engagement mechanics, will determine whether gaming becomes more consciously designed toward human flourishing or whether it continues as vehicle for extractive corporate profit. The medium's potential for creativity, connection, and meaning-making is undeniable. Whether that potential will be realized depends not on technology or commerce but on choices we collectively make about the medium's future. Gaming stands at a crossroads. The past century demonstrated its capacity for joy, creativity, and connection. The next century will determine whether those capacities can be preserved and expanded while addressing the systemic harms that have emerged alongside the medium's growth.